Making peace with yourself is hard when you've spent years fighting your own heart. You can smile in front of people and still feel like there is a quiet war happening inside you. You can wake up every morning trying to be better, stronger, calmer, and more acceptable, but deep down, still feel like you are running from the same pain, the same guilt, the same memories, and the same version of yourself you never fully forgave. Maybe you have carried wounds for so long that peace no longer feels natural. Maybe suffering became familiar. Maybe blaming yourself became a habit. Maybe you learned to survive by hiding what hurt you, pretending you were fine, and becoming strong on the outside while your heart stayed tired on the inside. Now, even when life becomes calm, your mind still searches for something to fight, because it does not know how to rest without pain. But Buddhist wisdom teaches that healing does not begin when you finally become perfect. Healing begins when you stop treating your own heart like an enemy. It begins when you look at your past with honesty instead of hatred, when you stop punishing yourself for the person you became while trying to survive, and when you understand that your pain was not proof that you were broken. It was proof that something inside you was asking to be seen with compassion. Tonight, as you listen, something in you may slowly begin to soften. The old anger, the hidden shame, and the need to keep fighting every thought, every mistake, and every memory will start to lose their power. Little by little, you may discover that peace was never about escaping yourself. It was about finally coming home to yourself. This is not just an audio to help you sleep. This is a quiet return to the heart you abandoned while trying to survive. Are you ready? Let's begin. For a long time, you may have believed the real problem was the pain itself. But slowly, another truth begins to appear. Sometimes, the deeper suffering is not the wound. It is the constant reopening of it. It is the endless return to memories that already happened, conversations that already ended, and emotions that the heart keeps reliving as if they are still happening now. And without realizing it, many people spend years trapped inside emotional cycles that quietly prevent healing from ever fully beginning. Something painful happens when the mind becomes too familiar with suffering. Peace starts to feel strange. Calm feels empty. Silence feels uncomfortable. And the heart begins returning to old pain, not because it enjoys suffering, but because suffering feels known. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar peace. There is a strange comfort in emotional wounds that stay open for years, not because the pain feels good, but because the mind becomes attached to what it already understands. Human beings naturally move toward what feels familiar, even when that familiarity hurts them. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. Many people are not only wounded by their past, they are emotionally living inside it every single day. A person can leave a painful relationship and still emotionally remain there for 10 more years. A person can survive rejection but continue replaying it every night before sleep. Someone can hear criticism once and silently repeat it inside their mind for the rest of their life. The body moves forward, but the mind keeps reopening the same emotional door over and over again. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment is not only attachment to pleasure. Human beings also become attached to suffering. The ego often clings to painful stories because those stories slowly become identity. The mind begins saying, "This pain is who I am." And once suffering becomes identity, healing feels threatening because healing would require becoming someone new. This is why some people unknowingly sabotage their own peace. The moment life becomes calm, the mind searches for another problem. The moment healing begins, old memories suddenly return stronger. It almost feels as if the heart does not trust peace enough to stay there. Many wounded people secretly fear peace because peace feels unfamiliar. Chaos was their emotional home for too long. Their nervous system learned survival instead of rest. Their thoughts became addicted to tension, fear, guilt, regret, and emotional replaying. Even when danger disappears, the body still reacts as if something terrible is about to happen. This is why overthinking becomes so exhausting. It is not just thinking, it is emotional reopening. Every time the mind replays an old betrayal, rejection, or failure, the nervous system relives it again. The body reacts as though the pain is happening in the present moment. Heartbeat changes, muscles tighten, breathing becomes shallow. The suffering renews itself. The mind says, maybe if I think about it enough, I will finally understand it. But often, understanding is not what the mind is seeking. Control is. The ego believes that if it keeps revisiting pain, it can somehow prevent future pain. But instead, it creates an endless emotional prison. Some people spend years mentally arguing with people who are no longer even part of their lives. Entire conversations continue inside the mind long after the relationship ended. The person may be gone physically, but emotionally they still occupy space inside the heart every single day. This becomes even more dangerous when pain turns into self-punishment. Many people believe suffering is proof that they care. They believe constantly hurting over something means they are being responsible, loving, loyal, or morally good. They unconsciously feel guilty for healing too quickly. So they continue reopening emotional wounds because part of them believes they deserve to keep suffering. This happens often after mistakes. A person may genuinely change, grow, apologize, and become wiser, but still refuse to forgive themselves. Their mind keeps replaying the old version of who they were. No matter how much life moves forward, they emotionally stay trapped in a past identity. Buddhism teaches that clinging creates suffering. But many people misunderstand this teaching. Clinging is not only holding on to people or possessions. Clinging also means holding on to painful emotional identities. The abandoned one, the rejected one, the broken one, the guilty one. The ego becomes attached to these identities because they explain the pain. Without them, the person no longer knows who they are. This is why healing can feel terrifying. If you stop suffering, who are you without the story? If you finally let the wound close, what happens to the identity you built around it? Many people fear this question more than they fear the pain itself. The human mind likes certainty, even painful certainty. Pain that is familiar can feel safer than a future that is unknown. This is why some people stay emotionally attached to sadness for years. Happiness feels unstable to them. Peace feels temporary. But suffering feels dependable because it has been there for so long. There are people who no longer know how to relax without guilt. The moment they rest, their mind begins searching for mistakes. The moment they feel joy, they suddenly remember painful memories. Their nervous system became trained to expect emotional danger at all times. This often begins in childhood. Some people grew up in homes where love felt unpredictable. They learned that emotional safety could disappear suddenly, so their mind became hyper-alert. They constantly scanned for problems because being relaxed once led to disappointment, criticism, abandonment, or pain. Years later, even when life becomes safer, the nervous system still behaves like survival mode is necessary. The person keeps reopening emotional wounds because their body learned that vigilance equals protection. But constant emotional vigilance slowly destroys inner peace. A heart cannot heal while it is constantly being forced to relive old suffering. This is why Buddhist teachings place so much importance on awareness. Most suffering becomes stronger because it happens unconsciously. The mind automatically returns to pain without the person even realizing it. A memory appears, then another, then another. Suddenly, the entire emotional state collapses into old sadness again. Awareness interrupts this cycle. The moment you become aware that your mind is reopening wounds again, something powerful begins to happen. You stop fully merging with the pain. You begin observing it instead. There is a huge difference between saying, "I am broken," and saying, "My mind is replaying pain right now." One creates identity, the other creates awareness. Awareness gives space between you and the suffering. That space is where healing begins. But healing does not happen by force. Many people try to bully themselves into peace. They say things like, "I should be over this already. Why am I still thinking about this? What is wrong with me?" But this only creates another wound on top of the first one. The heart cannot heal through shame. This is one of the deepest Buddhist truths. Compassion is not weakness. Compassion is emotional honesty without cruelty. It is the ability to sit beside your pain without becoming violent toward yourself. A wounded heart does not need punishment. It needs understanding. Many people were never taught this. They learned how to criticize themselves, compare themselves, and suppress emotions, but never learned how to comfort themselves gently. So every time pain appears, they attack themselves for still feeling it. This creates a cycle where the original wound becomes smaller than the self-hatred surrounding it. Sometimes the suffering is no longer coming from what happened. It is coming from the endless judgment toward yourself for still hurting. This is why self-compassion feels uncomfortable at first. People who spent years emotionally surviving often believe gentleness is dangerous. They think softness will make them weak. But real healing only begins when the war against yourself slows down. And this does not mean pretending the pain never existed. Buddhism never teaches emotional denial. It teaches non-attachment. There is a difference. Denial says, "This never hurt me." Non-attachment says, "This hurt me deeply, but I do not need to keep reopening the wound forever." That difference changes everything. Some emotional wounds stay open because the person secretly hopes the past will change someday. They replay conversations because part of them still wants a different outcome. They revisit betrayal because part of them still wants justice. They relive rejection because part of them still wants validation from the people who hurt them. But healing begins when you slowly accept that the past cannot become different through mental replaying. No amount of overthinking can rewrite yesterday. This acceptance is painful at first because the ego hates letting go of unfinished emotional stories. The mind keeps believing one more thought, one more replay, one more analysis will finally bring peace. But often, the replaying itself is what blocks peace from arriving. The wound keeps reopening because the mind keeps touching it. A physical wound cannot heal if someone scratches it every day. Emotional wounds work the same way. This does not mean memories disappear forever. Some pain leaves permanent marks on the heart. But there is a difference between carrying a scar and carrying an open wound. A scar no longer bleeds every time life touches it. And this is what healing slowly becomes. Not forgetting, not pretending, not becoming emotionless, but reaching a place where the memory no longer controls your nervous system every day. Peace begins quietly. Sometimes it begins with noticing your thoughts instead of drowning inside them. Sometimes it begins with allowing yourself to rest without earning it. Sometimes it begins with realizing that suffering does not make you more worthy of love. Many people secretly believe they must continue hurting in order to prove something. Prove loyalty, prove regret, prove love, prove goodness. But endless suffering proves nothing except that the heart became trapped in survival. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that all things change, including pain, but suffering becomes permanent when the mind refuses to release its attachment to emotional identity. You are not your worst moment. You are not the abandoned version of yourself. You are not the mistake you made years ago. You are not every painful thing someone once said to you. Those experiences happened, but they are not your entire existence. A peaceful heart is not a heart that never suffered. It is a heart that stopped building a home inside suffering. And maybe this is the hardest part of healing, accepting that peace may feel unfamiliar at first, accepting that calm may feel strange after years of emotional chaos, accepting that your nervous system may not immediately trust safety. But little by little the heart learns. The mind learns that silence is not danger. The body learns that rest is not weakness. The soul learns that healing is not betrayal, and eventually something beautiful begins happening. The emotional wounds that once controlled your entire identity slowly lose their grip, not because you forced them away, but because you stopped feeding them with endless reopening. For the first time in a long time, you stop asking the pain to define you. And quietly, gently, your heart begins remembering what peace feels like. Slowly, the heart begins to understand something it was never taught before. Healing is not only about letting go of pain, it is also about learning how to stop abandoning yourself, because many people spend so much time fighting their wounds that they never notice another quiet tragedy happening underneath it all. They learn to give love to everyone except themselves. They learn to carry other people's emotions while ignoring their own exhaustion. And after years of surviving this way, choosing themselves starts feeling wrong, uncomfortable, and deeply guilt-filled. There is a sadness that appears the moment you finally try to protect your own peace. A strange guilt rises inside the chest when you say no, rest, step back, or finally admit that you are tired. Part of you wants relief, but another part immediately whispers, "You are being selfish." That voice did not appear by accident. It was built slowly over years of conditioning. Many people were taught from childhood that love means sacrifice. Love meant enduring pain quietly. Love meant making everyone comfortable, even when you were emotionally collapsing inside. Love meant staying available, understanding, forgiving, patient, helpful, and emotionally useful at all times. Somewhere along the way, your worth became connected to how much of yourself you were willing to give away. And because of that, choosing yourself now feels unnatural. A quiet ache begins forming inside people who spend years ignoring their own needs. At first, they do not notice it. They become experts at surviving emotionally. They smile when exhausted. They comfort others while silently needing comfort themselves. They keep showing up for everyone while abandoning themselves more and more each day. Eventually, this self-abandonment becomes so normal that they stop recognizing it as suffering. Then one day, something inside finally becomes too tired to continue. Maybe the body begins shutting down emotionally. Maybe resentment starts quietly building. Maybe the heart no longer feels connected to anything anymore. The soul begins whispering that something is deeply wrong. But the person still struggles to choose themselves because guilt immediately appears the moment they try. This guilt is not proof that self-care is wrong. It is proof that you were conditioned to believe your needs matter less than everyone else's. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering grows whenever we become disconnected from our true nature. And one of the deepest disconnections happens when a person constantly sacrifices their emotional well-being in order to feel worthy of love. Many people do not realize how early this conditioning begins. Some children receive love only when they are useful, obedient, quiet, or emotionally easy to manage. They quickly learn that expressing needs creates tension, asking for help creates disappointment, having emotions becomes a burden to others, so they begin suppressing themselves to preserve connection. The child slowly learns, if I take care of everyone else first, maybe I will still be loved. Years later, this becomes an adult who feels guilty resting, an adult who apologizes for having boundaries, an adult who feels anxious disappointing people, an adult who keeps overextending emotionally because their nervous system learned that self-sacrifice equals safety. This pattern becomes dangerous because the person eventually loses connection with their own inner voice. They become so focused on meeting everyone else's emotional needs that they stop asking themselves what they actually feel. There are people who can immediately sense everyone else's sadness, anger, or disappointment, but cannot identify their own emotions anymore. They became emotionally trained to monitor others constantly while ignoring themselves completely. This creates deep exhaustion, not only physical exhaustion, but spiritual exhaustion. The kind that comes from living a life where your own heart is always placed last. And the painful part is that many people are praised for this behavior. Society often rewards self-neglect when it looks like kindness. The person who never rests gets called strong. The person who tolerates emotional mistreatment gets called patient. The person who constantly sacrifices themselves gets called loving. But Buddhism reminds us that attachment to suffering can disguise itself as virtue. Many people are not loving others from a place of fullness. They are abandoning themselves in order to earn worthiness. There is a huge difference. Real compassion does not require self-destruction. Real love does not ask you to disappear emotionally. Real kindness does not demand that your nervous system live in permanent exhaustion. But for people who grew up emotionally conditioned to overgive, hearing this can feel uncomfortable. Part of them still believes that choosing themselves makes them bad. This is why boundaries feel terrifying for many wounded people. Boundaries trigger guilt because boundaries interrupt old survival patterns. The moment they stop over-explaining, over-giving, rescuing, fixing, or emotionally carrying others, anxiety appears. The nervous system reacts as though danger is happening. Some people immediately feel responsible for everyone's emotions the moment conflict appears. They rush to fix things, apologize, or emotionally shrink themselves to restore peace, not because they are weak, but because their body learned long ago that emotional harmony was necessary for survival. This creates adults who cannot relax when someone is upset with them. Even when they did nothing wrong, they carry invisible responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to manage. And because of this, choosing themselves often feels like hurting others. This becomes especially painful in relationships. Many people stay emotionally available long after they are drained because they fear disappointing others. They ignore their intuition. They silence their exhaustion. They tolerate emotional imbalance for years because guilt convinces them that leaving, resting, or protecting themselves would be cruel. Meanwhile, their own heart quietly breaks beneath the surface. The tragedy is that people who constantly self-sacrifice often believe they are being loving, but deep down, many are operating from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough unless they are useful. The ego quietly says, if I stop giving everything, maybe nobody will stay. This fear becomes a prison. Buddhist teachings often speak about attachment as a source of suffering. Many people think attachment only means attachment to people or material things. But attachment also exists in emotional roles and identities. Some people become attached to being the helper, the strong one, the understanding one, or the selfless one. These identities give them worth. They feel valuable only when needed by others. But eventually this emotional role becomes heavy, because no human being can endlessly pour from an empty heart without collapsing internally. And yet when they finally try resting, guilt attacks them immediately. They begin questioning themselves. Am I selfish? Am I becoming cold? Why do I feel bad for protecting my peace? The guilt feels real because the conditioning runs deep. For years they were taught that being good means constantly giving. So now receiving rest feels undeserved. But this is where Buddhist wisdom gently changes the perspective. A person cannot truly offer peace to others while living in constant war with themselves. Compassion that excludes yourself is incomplete compassion. Many people have never heard this before. They learn to extend understanding toward everyone except themselves. They forgive others faster than they forgive themselves. They comfort others while emotionally neglecting their own pain. They speak gently to hurting people, but speak harshly to themselves inside their own mind. This creates an inner life filled with silent cruelty. The person becomes emotionally divided. One part desperately needs care, while another part criticizes them for needing anything at all. This internal conflict slowly destroys peace, because eventually the soul becomes exhausted from constantly proving its worth through sacrifice. There comes a point where the heart quietly asks, "When do I finally matter too?" And for many people that question brings tears they cannot explain. Not because they are weak, but because they spent years emotionally disappearing for others. Some people no longer even know what they truly want. Their entire identity became built around anticipating everyone else's needs. They became experts at emotional adaptation. They learned how to shape themselves into whatever made others comfortable. But this creates deep emptiness over time. A person can spend years being loved for the version of themselves that constantly overgives while secretly feeling unseen underneath it all. Because deep inside, they know people are receiving their performance, not their authentic emotional truth. This is why self-care feels so emotionally complicated for wounded people. It is not just about taking a break or resting more. It is about undoing years of emotional conditioning that taught them their needs were inconvenient. And healing this pattern requires more than temporary self-care routines. It requires rebuilding the relationship with yourself completely. The first step often feels uncomfortable. You begin noticing how often you betray your own feelings to keep others comfortable. You notice how quickly guilt appears whenever you prioritize yourself. You notice how deeply your nervous system fears disappointing people. This awareness can feel painful at first because it reveals how much of your life has been driven by emotional survival instead of inner peace. But awareness is where transformation begins. The moment you see the pattern clearly, you slowly stop unconsciously obeying it. You begin realizing that guilt is not always a sign you are doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt simply appears because you are finally doing something different. This changes everything. Many people mistake discomfort for wrongdoing. But growth often feels uncomfortable because the nervous system is adjusting to unfamiliar emotional territory. For someone conditioned to self-sacrifice, rest feels unsafe. For someone conditioned to overgive, boundaries feel cruel. For someone conditioned to emotional survival, peace feels suspicious. But little by little, the heart begins learning new truths. You learn that saying no does not make you selfish. You learn that resting does not make you lazy. You learn that protecting your energy does not make you cold. You learn that your emotions deserve care too. And slowly, the guilt begins loosening its grip. This process takes time because emotional conditioning lives deeply inside the body, not just the mind. Even after intellectually understanding these truths, the nervous system may still react with anxiety when you choose yourself. That is normal. Healing is not about instantly removing all guilt. It is about slowly choosing yourself anyway, even while the guilt still exists. Every small moment matters. Every time you rest without apologizing, every time you stop over-explaining your boundaries, every time you allow someone to be disappointed without abandoning yourself emotionally, every time you listen to your exhaustion instead of overriding it. These moments slowly teach the nervous system that self-respect is safe, and eventually, something beautiful begins happening. You stop seeing yourself as a machine built only to emotionally serve others. You stop measuring your worth through sacrifice. You stop believing pain is the price you must pay to deserve love. Instead, a softer relationship with yourself begins forming. You begin asking yourself what you need instead of only asking what everyone else needs. You begin recognizing your emotions before they become emotional collapse. You begin protecting your peace before exhaustion destroys you completely. This is not selfishness. This is healing. And one of the deepest Buddhist truths is that inner peace cannot grow inside a person who constantly abandons themselves. The heart needs safety too. The soul needs gentleness too. Your exhaustion matters too. Many people spend their entire lives waiting for permission to finally care for themselves, but that permission rarely arrives from the outside world. It must come from within. This is why healing feels like reclaiming yourself slowly, not becoming selfish, not becoming emotionally closed, but finally understanding that your humanity deserves compassion too. The strange thing is that once people stop abandoning themselves, their love for others often becomes healthier, calmer, and more genuine. Why? Because it is no longer driven by fear, guilt, or emotional survival. It becomes love without self-erasure, compassion without emotional collapse, giving without losing yourself completely. And perhaps this is what your heart has needed all along. Not endless sacrifice, not constant emotional proving, not another lifetime spent earning worth through exhaustion, but the quiet realization that your existence already matters, even when you are resting, even when you disappoint someone, even when you choose your own peace. For the first time in a long time, you begin understanding that caring for yourself is not betrayal. It is the beginning of finally coming back to life emotionally. Little by little, the heart begins learning that choosing yourself is not selfish. But once that realization starts settling in, another deeper struggle quietly appears underneath it. Even after people stop abandoning themselves for others, many still continue hurting themselves from within. Not with physical pain, but with endless inner criticism. They speak to their past self with a level of cruelty they would never use on another human being. And without realizing it, they keep reopening old shame through constant judgment, making healing almost impossible to fully reach. There is a certain kind of pain that stays hidden for years because nobody else can see it. It happens silently inside the mind. It happens every time you remember who you used to be and immediately feel disgust, shame, embarrassment, or regret. It happens when your own memories become evidence in a private trial where you are both the accused and the punisher. Some people carry entire graveyards of self-hatred inside them. The painful part is that many do not even realize how violent their inner world has become. They think self-criticism is responsibility. They think harshness will somehow force them to become better. They believe punishing themselves proves growth. But what actually happens is something far more destructive. The heart slowly loses the ability to feel safe within itself. Healing becomes impossible when the mind constantly attacks the person trying to heal. There are people who survived heartbreak, rejection, abandonment, betrayal, humiliation, failure, and loneliness, but the deepest wound did not come from those experiences alone. The deepest wound came afterward from the way they spoke to themselves about those experiences for years. One mistake becomes a permanent identity. One weak season becomes lifelong shame. One emotional breakdown becomes proof that they are broken forever. This is the hidden violence of constantly judging your past self. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering grows stronger when attachment and aversion control the mind. Many people understand attachment, but few understand aversion toward themselves. They become emotionally attached to rejecting who they once were. They replay old memories not only with sadness, but with anger toward themselves for having been vulnerable, naive, emotional, desperate, insecure, trusting, weak, or lost. And slowly, their inner world becomes hostile. The mind turns into a place where no version of themselves is allowed compassion. This creates a terrifying emotional pattern. Every time the person remembers the past, they do not simply revisit the event. They relive self-condemnation all over again. The nervous system reacts as though the shame is still happening now. The body tightens, the chest becomes heavy, the heart collapses inward. And all of this happens because the mind refuses to stop attacking the version of you that was struggling to survive. Many people believe healing means becoming someone entirely different from who they once were. But Buddhist wisdom points towards something deeper. Healing is not rejecting your past self. Healing is understanding them with compassion. That is much harder than people realize, because many individuals secretly hate who they became during painful periods of life. They feel ashamed of how much they tolerated, how emotionally dependent they were, how afraid they acted, how insecure they sounded, how desperate they felt, or how long they stayed in situations that hurt them. Instead of seeing that version of themselves as wounded, they see them as pathetic. This creates deep inner division. One part of the heart is still hurting, while another part keeps criticizing the wound for existing at all. There are people who still mentally punish themselves for things that happened 10 or 20 years ago. The world moved on, but inside their own mind, the trial never ended. They became trapped inside emotional time. The past version of themselves remains frozen there, permanently judged and permanently unforgiven. Sometimes the criticism sounds loud. How could I be so stupid? How did I let that happen? What is wrong with me? But sometimes it becomes quieter and even more dangerous. It turns into constant, subtle shame. The person smiles, works, talks normally, and functions externally, but internally carries a deep belief that they are fundamentally flawed because of who they once were. This belief quietly destroys peace, because no human being can fully heal while secretly believing they are unworthy of compassion. Many wounded people become emotionally addicted to self-judgment because they believe criticism protects them from repeating mistakes. The ego says, if I stay hard on myself, I will never become weak again. But what actually happens is that the heart remains trapped in fear instead of growth. Fear cannot create lasting healing. Only understanding can. This does not mean avoiding responsibility. Buddhism never teaches denial or avoidance. It teaches awareness without cruelty. There is a difference between honestly learning from your past and emotionally torturing yourself over it forever. One creates wisdom, the other creates suffering. A person who constantly judges their past self often struggles to stay present emotionally. Why? Because part of their energy remains trapped in old shame. The mind keeps revisiting previous versions of themselves with resentment instead of compassion. Every memory becomes another opportunity for self-attack, and eventually the person begins fearing their own memories. Certain songs hurt, certain places trigger shame, certain conversations reopen old identities. Even moments of silence become dangerous because the mind immediately starts replaying painful versions of the past. This creates emotional exhaustion that many people cannot explain. They say things like, "I'm tired all the time," but often the exhaustion is not only physical, it comes from carrying endless inner conflict. The nervous system becomes overwhelmed from constantly fighting itself. Buddhist teachings often speak about the illusion of a fixed self. Human beings suffer because they cling to identities too tightly. But one of the saddest forms of this suffering happens when people permanently identify themselves with old pain and mistakes. A person changes, grows, matures, and evolves, yet still sees themselves only through the lens of who they were at their lowest point. That is not truth. That is attachment to shame. And shame is one of the heaviest emotional prisons the human heart can carry. Shame convinces people they do not deserve softness. It tells them they must keep suffering in order to repay their mistakes. It whispers that healing would mean letting themselves off too easily. So they continue emotionally punishing themselves because guilt feels morally safer than self-forgiveness. This is why forgiving yourself often feels harder than forgiving others. When another person suffers, compassion comes naturally. But when it comes to ourselves, many people become ruthless. They expect perfection from their wounded self. They expect wisdom from the version of themselves that was terrified. They expect emotional maturity from the version that was abandoned, neglected, or overwhelmed. This lack of compassion creates impossible emotional standards. The person looks backward using the wisdom they have now and judges the past version of themselves for not knowing what they know today. But this is deeply unfair. The version of you that made mistakes did not have your current awareness. The version of you that tolerated pain was operating from the emotional understanding they had at that time. The version of you that acted out, shut down, clung too tightly, or lost themselves was trying to survive internally with the tools they had available. Buddhist wisdom asks us to look deeper than behavior alone. Beneath every harmful pattern is suffering. Beneath every emotional mistake is unmet pain, fear, confusion, loneliness, or attachment. This does not excuse harmful actions, but it changes the way healing happens. Instead of asking, "Why was I so broken?" the heart slowly learns to ask, "What pain was I carrying back then?" That question changes everything, because wounded behavior often comes from wounded survival. Some people became emotionally needy because they spent years feeling abandoned. Some became controlling because life once felt terrifyingly unstable. Some became distant because vulnerability once led to pain. Some became people-pleasers because rejection once felt unbearable. Some lost themselves in relationships because they never learned how to feel worthy alone. These patterns did not appear from nowhere. And when you begin understanding your past self instead of attacking them, healing becomes softer and more honest. This softness is uncomfortable at first. Many people are afraid that compassion toward themselves will make them irresponsible. But true self-compassion actually creates deeper accountability because it removes the fear that blocks honest self-reflection. A person who feels emotionally safe inside themselves can finally look at the truth without collapsing. This is why inner criticism destroys healing more than external rejection ever could. External rejection hurts deeply, but eventually the event ends. Inner rejection follows you everywhere. A person can leave toxic environments and still carry a toxic voice inside their own head for decades. They escape the people who hurt them, but continue repeating the same emotional violence toward themselves every single day. And because this voice becomes familiar, many stop questioning it entirely. They assume harshness is normal. They assume self-hatred is motivation. They assume peace must be earned through perfection. But the heart cannot bloom in an environment of constant emotional attack. The soul becomes smaller when every memory is met with shame. This is why so many people secretly struggle to feel joy even after their life improves. Their external circumstances change, but internally they are still trapped inside old self-condemnation. They still see themselves through the eyes of guilt, through the eyes of failure, through the eyes of who they once were during survival, and because of this, they unconsciously resist happiness. Deep down, part of them still believes they deserve punishment more than peace. This becomes heartbreaking over time. A person may genuinely become kinder, wiser, calmer, healthier, and emotionally stronger, yet still speak about themselves with deep hatred because they cannot stop identifying with old pain. They become emotionally trapped inside outdated versions of themselves. But healing requires allowing yourself to evolve beyond your worst moments. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that all things are temporary, including identities. Thoughts change, emotions change, people change, seasons of life change. Nothing remains fixed forever. Yet many people keep forcing themselves to remain emotionally chained to who they once were. This creates endless suffering because the heart is never allowed renewal. There is a quiet grief in realizing how long you have been emotionally cruel to yourself. Many people hear their own inner voice one day and suddenly recognize how harsh it sounds. They realize they have spent years speaking to themselves in ways they would never speak to a hurting child. And often this inner voice was learned somewhere, maybe from parents, maybe from rejection, maybe from environments where mistakes were punished harshly, maybe from relationships that made you feel small. Over time, those voices became internalized until you began repeating them automatically inside your own mind. But Buddhist awareness allows something powerful to happen. You begin noticing that the voice attacking you is not the deepest truth of who you are. It is conditioning, it is learned suffering, it is fear repeating itself. And slowly, awareness creates distance from the criticism. You begin noticing the attack without automatically believing it. Instead of instantly collapsing into shame, you pause, you breathe, you observe. You recognize that your past self deserves understanding too. This does not happen overnight. The heart often resists compassion at first because criticism became emotionally familiar. Some people feel uncomfortable speaking gently to themselves because harshness feels safer. They fear that without self-judgment they will become weak, careless, or irresponsible. But healing is not built through fear. Fear creates hiding. Compassion creates honesty. A person who feels emotionally safe within themselves no longer needs endless self-punishment to grow. They can acknowledge mistakes without turning them into permanent identity. This changes the entire healing journey. Instead of carrying the past like chains, the past slowly becomes wisdom. Instead of seeing old pain as proof of worthlessness, it becomes evidence of survival. Instead of hating the person you once were, you begin understanding how deeply they were hurting. And perhaps this is one of the hardest forms of forgiveness in human life. Not forgiving those who hurt you, but forgiving the version of yourself that could not protect you back then. Forgiving the confused version, the emotionally exhausted version, the insecure version, the version that stayed too long, the version that begged for love, the version that broke down, the version that did not know better yet. That version of you was not your enemy. They were carrying pain you did not yet understand. And when this truth finally settles into the heart, something quiet begins changing inside. The war against yourself slowly softens. The memories stop feeling like evidence against your worth. The shame loosens its grip. For the first time in a long time, the heart stops demanding perfection in order to deserve compassion. And gently, almost invisibly, healing begins feeling possible again. Slowly, the heart begins softening toward the person it once hated. The past no longer feels like a prison that must be relived every day. But after enough self-judgment fades away, another painful truth quietly rises to the surface. Many people have spent so many years emotionally surviving that suffering itself became familiar. Chaos became normal. Emotional tension became home. And without realizing it, they reached a point where peace no longer feels comfortable. Rest feels unnatural unless pain is present beside it. There are people who do not know how to relax unless something is wrong. Silence makes them anxious. Calmness feels suspicious. The moment life becomes peaceful, their mind immediately starts searching for problems. They overthink conversations, expect disappointment, reopen old wounds, or create emotional tension inside themselves without understanding why. It almost feels like the nervous system has forgotten how to exist without suffering. This is one of the quietest forms of emotional exhaustion. The strange part is that many people believe they want peace more than anything. They pray for it. They fantasize about it. They tell themselves they are tired of emotional pain. But when peace finally arrives, something inside them becomes uncomfortable. They feel restless, uneasy, emotionally exposed, or strangely empty. This confusion happens because the body becomes conditioned by survival mode. When someone spends years emotionally struggling, their nervous system adapts to chaos. The mind learns to stay alert constantly. The body remains tense. Thoughts move quickly. Emotions become intense. Over time, this emotional state stops feeling temporary and starts feeling like identity. The person no longer simply experiences chaos. They become emotionally built around it. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment does not only happen toward pleasure or happiness. Human beings also become attached to suffering, fear, conflict, and emotional instability because familiarity creates unconscious comfort. The mind clings to what it knows, even when what it knows is painful. This is why some people repeatedly return to emotionally unhealthy situations. It is why some recreate conflict in peaceful relationships. It is why some feel emotionally empty when life finally becomes stable. Their nervous system learned how to survive chaos, but never learned how to live peacefully. Many people who grew up in emotionally unstable environments develop this pattern without realizing it. Maybe love in their home was unpredictable. Maybe affection disappeared suddenly. Maybe conflict happened constantly. Maybe safety never truly existed emotionally. In those environments, the nervous system learns an important survival rule: always stay prepared. The child becomes hyper-aware. They monitor moods. They scan for danger. They anticipate rejection. They learn to emotionally react quickly because calmness could disappear at any moment. Years later, the environment changes, but the body does not immediately forget. Even in safe situations, the nervous system still expects emotional danger. This creates adults who cannot fully rest. Even when nothing bad is happening, they feel internally unsettled. Their body waits for the next emotional storm. They become addicted to emotional anticipation because their nervous system equates alertness with safety. This becomes deeply exhausting. The body remains in a constant low-level state of stress. Sleep becomes difficult. Overthinking becomes automatic. Relaxation feels uncomfortable. The mind struggles to stay present because it is always emotionally preparing for what might go wrong next. And slowly, suffering becomes identity. Some people do not even know who they are outside of struggle. Their entire emotional life has revolved around surviving pain, fixing problems, enduring hardship, managing emotions, and carrying stress. Without those things, they feel lost. There are people who secretly panic when life becomes calm because they no longer know what role to play. When chaos existed, they knew exactly who they were: the fixer, the survivor, the caretaker, the overthinker, the emotionally strong one. But peace removes those familiar emotional roles. Suddenly the person must confront themselves without distraction, and for many wounded hearts, that silence feels terrifying. This is why emotional suffering can become strangely addictive, not because the pain feels enjoyable, but because it creates familiarity, identity, and emotional structure. Without suffering, some people feel emotionally directionless. Buddhist teachings often describe the restless nature of the mind. The ego constantly searches for stimulation because stillness forces confrontation with deeper truths. When someone has spent years emotionally surviving, stillness exposes unresolved wounds that were previously hidden beneath constant chaos. So instead of resting, the mind creates movement. It creates worry. It creates emotional replaying. It creates conflict. It creates future fears. It creates unnecessary emotional tension. The nervous system unconsciously chooses familiar suffering over unfamiliar peace. This pattern becomes especially visible in relationships. Some people feel emotionally disconnected in calm, healthy relationships because stability feels emotionally flat to their nervous system. They mistake peace for boredom because their body became accustomed to emotional intensity. They only feel emotionally alive when there is uncertainty, mixed signals, emotional chasing, tension, or instability. This is not because healthy love lacks depth. It is because their nervous system became chemically attached to survival emotions. The highs and lows became emotionally addictive. Chaos created adrenaline. Uncertainty created obsession. Emotional inconsistency created craving. And eventually, calm love starts feeling emotionally unfamiliar. This is heartbreaking because many people unconsciously reject the very peace they deeply need. Not because they want suffering, but because their body learned how to survive inside it. There are also people who become uncomfortable during rest itself. The moment they stop working, helping others, fixing problems, or staying busy, painful emotions immediately rise to the surface. So they keep themselves emotionally occupied at all times. Constant productivity, constant distraction, constant noise, constant emotional stimulation, because silence allows buried exhaustion to finally speak. And many people are terrified of what they might feel if they truly slowed down. This is one reason: emotional. Burnout becomes so severe in modern life. Many individuals are not only tired from responsibilities, they are tired from constantly outrunning themselves emotionally. Their entire life becomes emotional escape. But the body always keeps score. Eventually, exhaustion begins showing itself, sometimes through anxiety, sometimes through numbness, sometimes through emotional breakdowns, sometimes through unexplained emptiness. The nervous system eventually reaches a point where survival mode becomes unsustainable, and yet even then, many people still struggle to stop. Why? Because rest feels emotionally unsafe. The body says, if I stop preparing for danger, something bad will happen. This fear often exists beneath conscious awareness. The person may not even realize they are afraid of peace. They simply feel uncomfortable whenever life slows down. Buddhist wisdom teaches that awareness is the first doorway out of suffering. The moment you begin recognizing these patterns, something powerful changes. You stop automatically identifying with them. Instead of saying, "This is just who I am," you begin realizing, "This is what my nervous system learned." That distinction matters deeply, because what is learned can slowly be unlearned. But healing this pattern takes patience. A nervous system conditioned by years of emotional survival does not instantly trust peace. The body may continue reacting defensively even after life becomes safer. This is normal. Healing is not simply mental understanding. It is retraining the body to believe safety exists again. And this process can feel emotionally strange at first. For example, some people feel guilty when resting because stress became tied to productivity and worth. If they are not struggling, they feel lazy. If they are not emotionally carrying something heavy, they feel irresponsible. Others feel emotionally numb during calm periods because their nervous system became desensitized after years of high emotional intensity. Peace feels emotionally empty because the body became addicted to stronger emotional stimulation. Some people even create unnecessary emotional suffering unconsciously because chaos feels more emotionally alive than stability. They overanalyze harmless situations. They expect rejection where none exists. They assume people are angry. They reopen old emotional wounds. They become emotionally attached to painful memories, all because the nervous system keeps searching for familiar emotional territory. This does not make them broken, it makes them wounded, and wounded nervous systems need gentleness, not shame. One of the saddest things about emotional survival mode is that many people become proud of how much suffering they can endure. Society often praises exhaustion. People get admired for constantly sacrificing themselves, pushing through pain, staying busy, never resting, and carrying impossible emotional weight. But beneath this praise is often deep emotional disconnection. The person loses touch with softness. They forget how to feel safe without struggle. They no longer know how to simply exist peacefully. This is why some people become deeply uncomfortable around emotionally calm individuals. Calmness feels foreign to a nervous system trained in survival. It almost feels suspicious. The wounded mind asks, how can they be so relaxed? Don't they know something bad could happen? This hypervigilance becomes emotionally exhausting over time. The body remains tense. The jaw tightens. Breathing stays shallow. Sleep becomes light and restless. The mind never fully turns off. And eventually, the person forgets what true rest even feels like. Many people think rest only means sleeping or taking breaks. But true rest is deeper than that. It is the ability to exist without emotional defense. It is the ability to sit in stillness without panic. It is the ability to experience calmness without immediately searching for danger. For someone trapped in survival mode, this kind of peace can feel almost impossible at first. But Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that suffering is not identity. Pain happened, chaos happened, fear happened. But those experiences are not the deepest truth of who you are. The nervous system adapted to survive them. That adaptation once protected you. But eventually, survival strategies that once saved you begin hurting you. Hypervigilance becomes anxiety. Self-protection becomes emotional isolation. Constant alertness becomes exhaustion. Overthinking becomes suffering. The heart remains trapped in emergency mode long after the emergency ended. This is why healing often feels less dramatic than people expect. Sometimes healing is not becoming a completely different person. Sometimes it is simply teaching the body that it no longer needs to stay at war all the time. This happens slowly, very slowly. Sometimes it begins with noticing tension inside your body instead of ignoring it. Sometimes it begins with allowing silence without immediately reaching for distraction. Sometimes it begins with sitting peacefully for a few moments without needing emotional stimulation. Sometimes it begins with letting yourself enjoy calmness without feeling guilty for it. These small moments matter more than people realize, because every peaceful moment teaches the nervous system a new truth. You are safe right now. You do not need to emotionally prepare for disaster every second. You do not need suffering in order to deserve rest. You do not need chaos in order to feel alive. The body slowly learns these truths through repetition. At first, peace feels unfamiliar, then uncomfortable, then possible, and eventually, peace starts feeling natural in ways the wounded heart once believed could never happen. This transformation changes everything. The mind stops searching for conflict constantly. The body begins relaxing more easily. The nervous system no longer treats calmness like danger. The person starts recognizing that emotional suffering was never their true identity. It was simply the emotional environment they adapted to for survival. This realization often brings grief too. Many people mourn how long they lived disconnected from peace. They realize they spent years waiting for the next emotional disaster instead of truly living. But this grief is part of awakening, because once awareness arrives, the cycle slowly loses power. The person no longer romanticizes suffering. They no longer mistake chaos for passion. They no longer believe exhaustion equals worth. They begin understanding that rest is not laziness. Peace is not weakness. Calmness is not emptiness. And perhaps one of the most beautiful moments in healing happens when the nervous system finally experiences safety without immediately searching for danger afterward. For the first time in years, the body exhales completely. The heart stops bracing itself. The mind becomes quieter. And slowly, gently, the person realizes they no longer need emotional suffering in order to feel real. Slowly, the nervous system begins realizing it no longer needs to live inside constant emotional suffering. The body starts learning that peace is possible, that rest is safe, and that calmness does not always mean danger is coming next. But just when healing begins opening its doors, another hidden fear quietly appears beneath the surface. Many people are not only afraid of pain. Deep down, they are also afraid of becoming emotionally healthy, because after years of inner conflict, peace itself can start feeling unfamiliar, confusing, and even dangerous. There is a strange loneliness that appears when a wounded heart first encounters real peace. At first, it seems like the exact thing the soul has been begging for all along. The mind says it wants calmness. The body says it is tired of suffering. The heart says it wants healing. But when peace finally arrives, something unexpected happens. The nervous system becomes uncomfortable. Restlessness appears. Anxiety quietly rises. The person begins feeling emotionally exposed, almost as if calmness itself is unsafe. This confusion is one of the deepest emotional struggles many people never talk about. A wounded heart often learns how to survive conflict long before it learns how to receive peace. For years, emotional tension may have been normal. Stress became familiar. Overthinking became routine. Pain became predictable, but emotional health feels unknown, and the human mind often fears what it does not recognize. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment to suffering can become so deep that freedom itself feels threatening. Many people believe healing will immediately feel comforting, but often the beginning of healing feels emotionally disorienting. The old identity starts dissolving. Old emotional habits begin weakening. The inner chaos that once defined daily life slowly quiets down. And suddenly, the person no longer knows who they are without the conflict they carried for so long. This is why some people unconsciously resist healing, even while desperately wanting it. Inner conflict became emotionally familiar. The anxiety was familiar. The self-doubt was familiar. The emotional survival patterns were familiar. But peace asks the heart to step into emotional territory it has never truly lived in before. And that can feel terrifying. There are people who spent so many years emotionally bracing for pain that they no longer know how to exist without preparing for disaster. Even during happy moments, their mind quietly waits for something to go wrong. Even during calm seasons, part of them expects abandonment, rejection, disappointment, or emotional collapse. This hypervigilance becomes automatic. The body remains alert even when danger no longer exists. And when healing begins reducing that emotional tension, the nervous system sometimes reacts with fear instead of relief, because inner conflict had become emotionally connected to safety. Some people only felt emotionally prepared when they were worried. They only felt in control when they were overthinking. They only felt safe when they anticipated pain before it happened. Without those survival patterns, they suddenly feel emotionally defenseless. This is why emotional health can initially feel unstable to wounded people. The old suffering may have been painful, but it was predictable. Healing feels uncertain because it requires surrendering familiar emotional defenses. The ego often resists this deeply. The ego says, if I stop worrying, I will get hurt again. If I let my guard down, something terrible will happen. If I become peaceful, I will become weak. These thoughts are not signs of failure. They are signs that the nervous system has spent too long in survival mode. Buddhist teachings remind us that fear often appears right before transformation. The mind clings tightly to familiar identities because the unknown feels threatening, even when the unknown contains healing. Many wounded people secretly fear who they might become without suffering. If they stop overthinking, who are they? If they stop emotionally surviving, who are they? If they stop carrying constant inner conflict, what remains underneath? These questions create deep emotional discomfort because years of pain often become woven into identity itself. Some people built their entire sense of self around being wounded: the strong survivor, the abandoned one, the anxious one, the emotionally broken one, the misunderstood one, the one carrying heavy pain quietly. These identities become emotionally familiar over time. The person may consciously hate suffering, but unconsciously feel attached to the emotional role suffering created. Healing threatens those identities, and whenever identity begins dissolving, fear naturally appears. This fear becomes especially strong when a person starts experiencing moments of genuine emotional calmness for the first time. At first, the peace may feel beautiful, but shortly afterward, discomfort quietly enters. The mind begins asking strange questions. Why do I suddenly feel nervous when nothing is wrong? Why do I feel empty now that the chaos is gone? Why do I feel guilty for relaxing emotionally? These reactions happen because the nervous system has not yet learned how to trust peace fully. Many people expect healing to feel exciting and immediate, but often healing begins very quietly. Sometimes it feels almost boring compared to the emotional intensity of survival mode. And this can confuse wounded hearts deeply. Chaos creates emotional stimulation. Conflict creates emotional urgency. Pain creates emotional intensity. But peace feels softer, slower, still. And for nervous systems addicted to emotional intensity, stillness can initially feel emotionally empty. This does not mean peace is wrong. It means the body is adjusting. There are people who unconsciously create emotional problems during calm periods simply because peace feels too unfamiliar to sustain comfortably. They reopen old wounds. They search for hidden signs of rejection. They overanalyze harmless situations. They become suspicious of happiness itself. Part of them believes peace cannot last, so they emotionally prepare for its destruction before it even disappears. This is one of the saddest consequences of long-term emotional pain. The heart stops trusting good things. When suffering lasts long enough, the nervous system begins expecting loss automatically. Hope becomes dangerous. Vulnerability feels risky. Emotional openness feels unsafe because the heart remembers how painful previous disappointments were. So even when healing arrives, fear remains sitting quietly in the background. This fear often appears strongest during moments of genuine emotional intimacy or self-acceptance. The moment someone begins feeling emotionally safe, another part of them suddenly becomes afraid. Afraid of losing the peace, afraid of trusting too much, afraid of getting hurt again, afraid that the healing is temporary. This creates an exhausting emotional cycle where the person simultaneously craves peace and fears it. Buddhist wisdom explains that suffering often continues because the mind resists uncertainty, but healing requires stepping into uncertainty willingly. Emotional health cannot grow while the heart remains permanently defended against life. This does not mean becoming naive or emotionally careless. It means slowly teaching the nervous system that vulnerability and safety can exist together. For wounded people, this takes time, a long time sometimes, because emotional survival patterns are deeply physical, not just mental. The body remembers years of fear. The nervous system remembers emotional danger. The heart remembers what it felt like to be hurt unexpectedly. So when peace begins arriving, the body may not immediately recognize it as safe. Instead, the body may react with suspicion. This is why many people feel emotionally tired during healing itself. They think something is wrong because they still feel anxious even while improving emotionally. But often the exhaustion comes from the nervous system learning an entirely new way of existing. Healing is not only emotional release, It is nervous system retraining. The body slowly learns that not every silence leads to abandonment. Not every disagreement leads to disaster. Not every calm moment hides incoming pain. Not every peaceful season will suddenly collapse. These truths sound simple intellectually, but emotionally they can feel revolutionary for wounded hearts. Some people spent their entire life emotionally waiting for things to fall apart. So stability feels emotionally unnatural. Even happiness can create anxiety. The person begins thinking, "What if I lose this?" This fear quietly steals the ability to fully experience the present moment. The wounded heart braces itself constantly because it believes emotional preparedness can prevent future suffering. But this constant emotional bracing slowly destroys peace from within. The body never fully relaxes, the mind never fully rests, the soul never fully arrives in the present. Buddhist teachings invite people to witness these fears without becoming consumed by them. Awareness changes everything. The moment you recognize that your fear of peace comes from old survival patterns, something softens inside. You stop seeing yourself as broken. Instead, you begin understanding that your nervous system adapted to difficult experiences the best way it knew how. This understanding creates compassion. And compassion is necessary because many people shame themselves for struggling to feel safe during healing. They say things like, "Why can't I just enjoy peace normally? What is wrong with me? Why do I still feel anxious when life is finally okay?" But these reactions are not weakness. They are emotional conditioning, slowly unraveling. A wounded heart often expects healing to happen instantly once life improves externally. But emotional wounds heal gradually because the nervous system needs repeated experiences of safety before it fully relaxes. Trust takes time, especially self-trust. Many people lost trust in their own emotional safety years ago. They became disconnected from their intuition because survival mode demanded constant external focus. They learned to monitor danger instead of listening inwardly. So when healing begins, reconnecting with the self can feel overwhelming. For the first time in years, buried emotions rise to the surface. Grief appears, loneliness appears, fear appears. The person realizes how exhausted they truly are underneath the survival patterns. And this emotional honesty can feel terrifying because inner conflict once served as distraction from deeper pain. But Buddhist wisdom reminds us that avoiding pain only extends suffering. Healing requires gently turning toward what was ignored for too long, not violently, not forcefully, but patiently. Like slowly approaching a frightened animal. The heart cannot be bullied into peace. It must slowly learn safety through gentleness. This is why self-compassion becomes so important during healing. Without compassion, people often panic when discomfort appears during emotional growth. They assume fear means they are failing, but fear often means transformation is happening. The old identity is dissolving. The old survival patterns are weakening. The nervous system is learning new emotional truths, and naturally, that process feels vulnerable. Some days, peace will feel beautiful. Other days, it will feel uncomfortable. Some days, the heart will trust healing. Other days, it will want to retreat back into old emotional defenses. This fluctuation is normal. Healing is not a straight path. The wounded heart learns safety in layers, and over time, something remarkable begins happening. The person no longer feels emotionally threatened by calmness. Silence becomes softer. Stillness becomes tolerable. Rest no longer feels dangerous. The body slowly stops expecting emotional disaster every moment. For the first time in years, the nervous system begins understanding that peace is not emptiness. Peace is presence. Peace is safety. Peace is finally existing without constantly preparing for pain. This transformation changes the relationship with life itself. The person no longer needs chaos in order to feel alive. They no longer confuse emotional intensity with love. They no longer mistake suffering for depth. Instead, they begin discovering something quieter but infinitely more healing. The beauty of emotional stability, the softness of inner calm, the freedom of no longer carrying endless internal war. And perhaps the most beautiful part of all is this. Eventually, the heart stops fearing healing itself. It stops treating peace like a threat. It stops searching for reasons to suffer. And slowly, gently, the wounded soul begins trusting that it is finally safe to live differently now. Slowly, the wounded heart begins trusting that peace is no longer dangerous. The nervous system starts learning that calmness can exist without punishment following afterward. But as healing deepens, another painful realization quietly rises to the surface. Many people have spent so much of their life pretending to be strong that they no longer know how to feel honestly anymore. They became experts at surviving emotionally, but strangers to their own inner world. And beneath that performance of strength lives a deep spiritual exhaustion that words often fail to explain. Some pain does not come from crying too much. It comes from holding everything in for too long. There are people who have spent years acting like they are okay while quietly falling apart inside. They became the calm one, the dependable one, the emotionally strong one, the one who never complains, the one who carries pain silently so nobody else feels uncomfortable. At first, this behavior looks admirable from the outside. People praise them for being resilient, for being mature, for handling everything so well. But beneath that appearance is often a heart slowly disconnecting from itself, because human beings are not meant to endlessly perform strength without emotional release. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering grows whenever we deny the truth of our present experience. And one of the deepest forms of denial happens when people suppress their real emotions in order to appear emotionally strong. This suppression rarely happens all at once. It begins slowly. A child cries and gets told they are too sensitive. Someone expresses pain and gets ignored. Someone asks for comfort and feels like a burden. Someone becomes vulnerable and gets hurt for it. Over time, the nervous system learns a dangerous lesson. Feeling openly is unsafe. So the heart adapts. It hides sadness. It swallows anger. It minimizes pain. It smiles through exhaustion. It learns how to emotionally disappear while still functioning outwardly. Years later, the person no longer even realizes how disconnected they have become from themselves. They know how to survive, but they do not know how to emotionally exist honestly anymore. This creates a strange emptiness inside many wounded people. They can talk to others, go to work, laugh occasionally, and continue functioning normally, but deep inside they feel emotionally distant from themselves. Something feels numb, something feels blocked, something feels missing. Often, what is missing is emotional honesty. The soul becomes exhausted when it must constantly wear emotional armor. There is a difference between genuine strength and emotional suppression, but many people confuse the two. Genuine strength allows emotions to move honestly through the heart without shame. Emotional suppression forces the heart into silence because vulnerability feels dangerous. One creates healing, the other creates inner separation. Many people spent so much time becoming who others needed them to be that they lost touch with how they actually feel. They became emotionally performative, not fake intentionally but conditioned. Their nervous system learned that maintaining control mattered more than expressing truth. This becomes especially common in people who had to survive emotionally difficult environments. In homes where emotions were punished, ignored, mocked, or treated as weakness, children quickly learn to disconnect from vulnerable feelings. Some become hyper-independent, some become emotionally numb, some become chronic caretakers, Some become overly logical and disconnected from emotion entirely. These are survival responses. The body adapts however it can, but eventually those survival strategies begin creating suffering. A person who constantly suppresses sadness may eventually lose access to joy too. A person who never allows anger may slowly lose connection with boundaries. A person who always acts strong may no longer know how to ask for help when they truly need it. This is one of the hidden costs of emotional performance. Suppressed emotions do not disappear. They remain inside the nervous system, quietly shaping behavior, relationships, thoughts, and physical well-being. The body remembers what the mind avoids. Many emotionally exhausted people do not even realize they are carrying years of unfelt emotion. They simply know they feel tired all the time, heavy, detached, restless, empty in ways they cannot explain, but beneath that exhaustion often lives emotional buildup that never received space to move safely. Grief that was never processed, fear that was never spoken, loneliness that was never comforted, anger that was never acknowledged, pain that was never allowed to breathe honestly. Instead of feeling these emotions fully, the person learned how to bury them beneath performance. Performance becomes survival. I'm fine. It doesn't bother me. I can handle it. I don't need anyone. These sentences become emotional armor, and the longer someone wears armor, the harder it becomes to remove it, because eventually the person forgets where the armor ends and the real self begins. This creates deep spiritual exhaustion, not just emotional exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion, the kind that happens when the soul spends years hiding from its own truth. Buddhist teachings often speak about the suffering created by attachment to identity. One painful identity many people carry is the strong one. They become emotionally attached to being the person who never breaks down. At first, this identity may protect them, but eventually it traps them, because now vulnerability feels like failure. Rest feels weak. Needing support feels shameful. The person becomes emotionally isolated inside their own performance. There are people who have not cried honestly in years, not because they are healed, but because their nervous system no longer feels safe enough to release emotion naturally. The body stays controlled constantly, the face stays composed, the voice stays calm, but underneath that control is often deep emotional pressure, and pressure that never gets released eventually turns inward. This is why emotional suppression can quietly create anxiety, numbness, chronic tension, panic, emotional shutdown, and even physical symptoms in the body. The nervous system cannot endlessly carry unprocessed emotion without consequence. The soul eventually begins asking to be heard. This is why some people suddenly break down emotionally over seemingly small things: a simple conversation, a song, a memory, a quiet moment alone. The emotional release seems disproportionate to the situation, but often the tears are carrying years of suppressed feeling all at once. The body finally reaches its limit. Many wounded people fear these moments deeply because they spent their entire life believing emotional control equals safety. Losing composure feels terrifying to them, but Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that emotions themselves are not the enemy. Resistance to emotion often creates greater suffering than the emotion itself. Sadness moves naturally when allowed. Grief softens when acknowledged. Fear loses intensity when witnessed compassionately. But suppression traps emotions inside the nervous system, and trapped emotions slowly disconnect people from themselves. Some individuals become so emotionally disconnected that they struggle identifying what they actually feel. When asked how they are doing, they answer intellectually instead of emotionally. They analyze themselves rather than experience themselves. This happens because emotional suppression teaches the mind to override the heart constantly. Logic becomes protection. Busyness becomes distraction. Productivity becomes avoidance. The person stays moving because stillness would expose emotions they have spent years avoiding. But eventually, avoidance becomes exhausting too. The soul becomes tired of pretending, tired of performing stability, tired of acting unaffected, tired of carrying invisible emotional weight alone. And deep down, many emotionally strong people secretly wish someone would notice how exhausted they really are beneath the performance. But often, nobody notices because they became too good at hiding it. This creates another painful cycle. The more emotionally capable someone appears, the less support they often receive. People assume they are fine because they look fine externally. Meanwhile, the person quietly feels unseen, not because others do not care, but because the performance became too convincing. This loneliness becomes especially painful in adulthood. Many emotionally suppressed people crave deep connection while simultaneously struggling to let anyone truly see them. Part of them longs for emotional intimacy. Another part fears vulnerability deeply. So relationships remain emotionally partial. The person shares enough to function socially, but rarely enough to feel truly known. This creates hidden emotional isolation. A person can be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly alone when nobody has access to their real emotional world. Buddhist wisdom teaches that liberation begins with truthfulness toward oneself. Not performative truth, real truth. Honest awareness of what is actually happening inside the heart. This honesty can feel frightening at first because many people built their entire identity around emotional control. Without the performance, they fear falling apart completely. But healing does not ask you to collapse endlessly into emotion. It asks you to stop abandoning yourself emotionally. There is a huge difference. Feeling honestly does not make someone weak. In fact, it often requires far more courage than suppression ever did. It takes courage to admit exhaustion, courage to acknowledge sadness, courage to say, "I am hurting," courage to stop pretending everything is okay when it is not. Many people spent years believing that emotional honesty would make them less lovable. They feared becoming too much for others. So they learned to emotionally reduce themselves. They became low maintenance emotionally, easygoing emotionally, quiet emotionally. But internally, they carried oceans of unspoken feeling. This creates a painful disconnect between external appearance and internal reality. Over time, the person may even begin feeling detached from their own life because so much emotional energy goes into maintaining the performance. The soul quietly asks, when do I finally get to be real? And for many people, that question alone brings grief they cannot explain, because they realize how long they have lived emotionally hidden from themselves. Buddhist awareness changes this slowly. Awareness notices the suppression without judgment. It notices the emotional tightening, the forced composure, the automatic minimization, the nervous laughter hiding sadness, the constant "I'm okay" responses, the body holding tension constantly. And once awareness notices these patterns clearly, healing can finally begin. Not through forcing emotion, not through dramatic breakdowns, but through gentle honesty, small moments of truth, small moments of emotional permission, allowing yourself to admit when something hurts, allowing yourself to feel disappointment without invalidating it, allowing yourself to cry without immediately apologizing for it, allowing yourself to need comfort sometimes. These moments slowly reconnect the heart with itself again. At first, this process may feel emotionally awkward. Many suppressed people feel uncomfortable with vulnerability because the nervous system associates openness with danger. But over time, the body begins learning something new. Emotions are not enemies. Feelings are not weakness. Needing support is not failure. Human softness is not shameful. And slowly the armor begins loosening. The person no longer needs to perform strength every second in order to feel safe. They stop forcing themselves to carry impossible emotional weight alone. They stop treating vulnerability like weakness. They stop abandoning their own emotional reality in order to appear stable for everyone else. Instead, something softer emerges. Authentic strength. Not the rigid strength built through suppression, but the calm strength built through emotional honesty. This kind of strength does not fear tears. It does not fear truth. It does not fear tenderness, because it understands something survival mode never allowed the heart to believe before. You do not need to stop being human in order to survive life. You do not need to disconnect from your emotions in order to be worthy. You do not need to perform invincibility to deserve love. And perhaps the deepest healing begins the moment you finally stop asking your heart to hide its pain just to make others comfortable. For the first time in a long time, the soul begins breathing honestly again. The exhaustion slowly softens. The numbness begins melting. The emotional walls stop feeling necessary all the time. And gently, quietly, you begin remembering what it feels like to truly be alive inside yourself again. Slowly, the heart begins learning that true strength does not come from emotional suppression. The soul no longer needs to hide every wound behind silence and performance. But once the emotional armor starts loosening, another painful truth quietly appears underneath it all. Many people are still carrying punishments life already released them from years ago. The world moved forward, other people forgot. Time passed, seasons changed, yet deep inside they continue sentencing themselves over and over again for mistakes, failures, weaknesses, and painful chapters they cannot stop reliving. Some people live inside invisible prisons nobody else can see. They wake up every day carrying guilt that no longer belongs to the present moment. They smile, work, talk normally, and continue moving through life, but internally they remain chained to old shame. And the saddest part is that many no longer realize they are still punishing themselves at all. There is a certain kind of suffering that becomes so familiar it starts feeling deserved. A person makes mistakes. A relationship ends badly. A painful season changes them. Maybe they hurt someone. Maybe they failed themselves. Maybe they became someone they barely recognized during survival mode. And instead of allowing growth, they quietly decide that peace is no longer something they deserve fully. This decision often happens unconsciously. The person never says it directly, but it appears in the way they treat themselves afterward. They deny themselves happiness. They sabotage good things. They stay emotionally trapped in guilt. They refuse softness. They replay old memories repeatedly like emotional self-punishment. The heart slowly becomes convinced that suffering is necessary repayment for the past. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment creates suffering, but one of the deepest attachments people carry is attachment to shame. Many individuals become emotionally attached to guilt because guilt creates the illusion of control and morality. They believe continuing to punish themselves proves they care about what happened. The ego quietly whispers, "If I stop suffering over this, maybe it means I never cared." So the punishment continues, not because healing is impossible, but because the person unconsciously believes self-forgiveness would make them irresponsible, selfish, or morally weak. This creates endless inner conflict. The soul wants peace, but the ego clings to punishment. And over time, this internal battle becomes exhausting. Many wounded people carry shame so deeply that it shapes their entire identity. They stop seeing themselves as human beings who experienced painful moments and begin seeing themselves only through the lens of those moments. One mistake becomes permanent identity. One painful season becomes evidence of unworthiness. One version of themselves becomes emotionally frozen forever in guilt. This is why unresolved shame becomes such a powerful prison. It traps the person inside outdated emotional identities long after life itself has already moved forward. Sometimes the punishment looks obvious: constant self-criticism, harsh inner dialogue, refusing joy, refusing love. But sometimes it becomes quieter and harder to recognize. The person overworks themselves endlessly. They settle for emotionally unhealthy relationships because they feel undeserving of better. They reject opportunities. They emotionally isolate themselves. They become uncomfortable when people genuinely care about them. They quietly carry the belief that they are not fully worthy of peace anymore. This belief changes everything, because a person who secretly believes they deserve suffering will unconsciously create it repeatedly. Buddhist teachings remind us that suffering often continues because the mind refuses to release old emotional attachments. Shame is one of the heaviest attachments the heart can carry, because shame tells the person they are fundamentally flawed instead of temporarily human. There is a difference between guilt and shame. Healthy guilt says, "I made a mistake." Shame says, "I am the mistake." That difference changes the entire emotional experience. Healthy guilt can lead to growth, accountability, and wisdom. Shame creates self-condemnation and emotional paralysis. A person trapped in shame no longer believes they can evolve beyond the past. They become emotionally stuck inside old identities that no longer reflect who they truly are. This is why many people secretly fear being seen deeply. They believe if others truly knew everything about them, they would no longer deserve love or acceptance. The painful part is that life itself often already forgave them in many ways. Time moved on, people healed, situations changed, the world continued turning, but inside their own mind, the punishment never ended. Some people are still emotionally apologizing for things they already changed years ago, still carrying guilt for younger versions of themselves who were overwhelmed, confused, emotionally wounded, or trying to survive. This creates deep spiritual exhaustion because the heart remains trapped inside emotional debt that can never fully be repaid through suffering. And yet many people keep trying. They believe enough self-hatred will somehow erase the past. Enough regret will somehow rewrite what happened. Enough punishment will somehow balance the emotional scales. But suffering cannot undo history. It only extends it. Buddhist wisdom gently teaches that clinging to guilt does not heal suffering. It prolongs attachment to pain. This does not mean avoiding accountability. True healing requires honesty. It requires recognizing harm clearly when harm was done. It requires emotional responsibility. But responsibility and self-condemnation are not the same thing. One creates awareness, the other destroys identity. Many wounded people cannot tell the difference. They think releasing shame means pretending nothing happened. But self-forgiveness is not denial. It is the understanding that human beings are capable of growth beyond their worst moments. The problem is that many people were never taught compassion toward themselves. They learned punishment, they learned criticism, they learned perfectionism, they learned emotional shame. So when they fail or make mistakes, their immediate instinct becomes self-destruction instead of understanding. This often begins early in life. Children raised in highly critical environments quickly learn to fear mistakes intensely. Love may have felt conditional. Acceptance may have depended on performance, obedience, or perfection. Over time, the child internalizes the belief that mistakes threaten worthiness itself. Years later, the adult continues treating themselves with the same harshness. Even small failures trigger overwhelming shame. Even ordinary human imperfection feels dangerous. The nervous system becomes trapped in constant self-monitoring. always trying not to fail, always trying not to disappoint, always trying not to become bad. This creates enormous emotional pressure, because no human being can exist without making mistakes, hurting others unintentionally sometimes, or failing during difficult seasons of life. Yet many people expect perfection from themselves while simultaneously carrying years of emotional wounds. This impossible expectation slowly crushes the spirit. Some people become emotionally addicted to guilt because guilt creates familiarity. It feels emotionally safer to remain the guilty person than to risk stepping into self-forgiveness and emotional freedom. Why? Because freedom creates uncertainty. If you finally forgive yourself, who are you afterward? If you stop carrying punishment, what remains underneath? These questions frighten the ego deeply because shame often becomes identity itself. The person no longer knows who they are without the guilt they carried for so long. This becomes especially painful after traumatic emotional seasons. People often judge themselves mercilessly for who they became while emotionally drowning. They hate the needy version, the angry version, the broken version, the emotionally unstable version, the fearful version. But Buddhist wisdom asks us to look deeper than behavior alone. Beneath wounded behavior usually lives wounded pain. This does not erase accountability, but it changes the emotional posture toward healing. Instead of asking, "Why was I so terrible?" the heart slowly begins asking, "What pain was I carrying during that time?" That question creates compassion, and compassion is necessary because shame alone never heals anyone. Shame only keeps the wound alive. Many people believe self-punishment protects them from repeating mistakes. They think if they remain hard on themselves constantly, they will avoid becoming careless or harmful again. But fear-based self-hatred rarely creates true transformation. It creates emotional paralysis. Real growth happens when awareness and compassion exist together. Without awareness, there is denial. Without compassion, there is destruction. Buddhist teachings consistently point toward the middle path, neither avoidance nor cruelty, honest seeing without emotional violence. This is one of the hardest lessons for wounded hearts to learn, because many people secretly believe they deserve emotional violence. Not physical violence necessarily, but internal violence, the harsh thoughts, the constant criticism, the endless replaying, the emotional withholding of peace, the refusal to move forward emotionally, all because part of them still believes punishment is necessary. There are people who sabotage loving relationships because they cannot believe they deserve healthy love anymore. People who reject opportunities because they secretly feel unworthy of success. People who emotionally isolate because shame convinced them they are too damaged to be fully known. This is how unresolved guilt quietly shapes entire lives. Not loudly, quietly, in the background, through avoidance, self-rejection, emotional withdrawal, fear of happiness, fear of being seen, fear of receiving good things fully. The body carries this shame too. The nervous system tightens around it. The chest feels heavy. The stomach feels anxious. The shoulders stay tense. The mind remains restless, because unresolved shame keeps the body emotionally trapped in survival. And many people become so accustomed to carrying this heaviness that they forget life can feel different. But Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that identity itself is fluid. Human beings are not frozen permanently in their worst moments. Every experience changes us. Every season transforms us. Every painful chapter teaches something. Yet shame refuses to allow this transformation emotionally. Shame keeps saying, "You are still that person," even when life already proved otherwise, even when growth already happened, even when wisdom was gained. This is why self-forgiveness often feels emotionally terrifying. It requires releasing identities built around suffering. It requires allowing yourself to evolve beyond the emotional prison your mind created years ago. And for many wounded people, this feels almost impossible at first, because self-forgiveness is not just emotional release. It is identity transformation. The person must slowly stop seeing themselves only through the lens of shame. That process takes courage. It requires sitting honestly with the past without drowning inside it. It requires acknowledging mistakes without turning them into permanent self-hatred. It requires understanding that being human includes imperfection, confusion, emotional struggle, and growth. This realization softens the heart slowly, not all at once. Slowly. The person begins noticing how harshly they speak to themselves. They begin noticing how often guilt shapes decisions. They begin noticing how deeply they fear peace. Awareness changes everything. Because once the pattern becomes visible, the punishment no longer operates entirely unconsciously. The heart begins questioning old beliefs. Do I really deserve endless suffering? Have I already changed more than I allow myself to see? Am I still emotionally living inside a past version of myself? These questions begin opening emotional doors that shame kept locked for years. At first, compassion may feel uncomfortable, even dangerous. Many people fear self-compassion because they misunderstand it. They think compassion means excusing harmful behavior or escaping accountability. But true compassion simply recognizes humanity honestly. A compassionate heart can acknowledge mistakes while still believing healing is possible. This balance is deeply important, because without compassion, the soul eventually collapses beneath endless self-condemnation. No human being can heal while permanently treating themselves like a criminal inside their own mind. The heart needs room to breathe again. It needs permission to evolve, permission to soften, permission to exist beyond the past. And perhaps one of the most painful truths of all is this. Many people are still carrying shame for versions of themselves that were simply trying to survive emotionally. They were overwhelmed, lonely, afraid, unhealed, confused, and instead of receiving understanding afterward, they received years of self-hatred from their own mind. But slowly, healing begins changing this relationship. The person starts realizing that suffering endlessly cannot undo old pain. Punishment cannot rewrite history. Self-condemnation cannot create peace. Only awareness, responsibility, compassion, and emotional honesty can begin freeing the heart. And eventually, something quiet starts happening inside. The old guilt loosens slightly. The nervous system stops bracing itself constantly. The heart no longer believes it must suffer forever to deserve healing. For the first time in years, the soul begins understanding something it was never allowed to believe before. You are allowed to grow beyond the worst chapters of your life. You are allowed to become someone new. You are allowed to stop punishing yourself for wounds time already carried away long ago. And gently, almost invisibly, the prison door inside the heart begins opening at last. Slowly, the prison door inside the heart begins opening. The soul starts realizing it no longer has to spend the rest of its life trapped inside old guilt and endless self-punishment. But once that heaviness begins loosening, another painful truth quietly reveals itself underneath everything else. Sometimes the deepest exhaustion in your life is not coming from other people, responsibilities, or difficult situations. Sometimes you are simply tired of fighting yourself every single day, tired of resisting your emotions, tired of arguing with your thoughts, tired of carrying inner conflict that never seems to fully end. There is a kind of exhaustion sleep cannot fix, a tiredness so deep that even resting the body does not touch it. The person sleeps for hours and still wakes up emotionally heavy. They take breaks but still feel drained. They try distracting themselves, staying busy, helping others, or pretending to be okay. But underneath it all, something inside still feels painfully exhausted. This kind of exhaustion often comes from inner war, not external hardship alone. Inner war. The constant battle between who you are and who you think you should be. The battle between your emotions and your attempts to suppress them. The battle between guilt and self-forgiveness. The battle between needing rest and forcing yourself to keep going. The battle between wanting peace and fearing it at the same time. Over time, this endless internal conflict slowly drains the soul more deeply than many external struggles ever could. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering becomes heavier when the mind resists reality constantly. Many people think emotional exhaustion only comes from life being difficult, but often the deeper suffering comes from fighting against their own emotional experience every moment. They fight sadness, fight fear, fight vulnerability, fight memories, fight loneliness, fight shame, fight themselves. And eventually, the soul becomes tired of carrying so much resistance inside. Many wounded people do not realize how much energy inner conflict consumes. Every suppressed emotion requires energy. Every unresolved fear requires energy. Every moment spent criticizing yourself, overthinking, emotionally defending yourself, or resisting your own truth quietly drains the nervous system. This is why some people feel emotionally exhausted even when nothing dramatic is happening externally anymore. The war is happening internally. Some individuals spend years trying to become emotionally different instead of emotionally honest. They constantly pressure themselves to heal faster, feel differently, think positively, move on quickly, stop hurting, stop fearing, stop struggling. And because of this, the heart never receives acceptance. It only receives pressure. This pressure slowly becomes spiritual exhaustion. The soul begins feeling like it can never simply exist as it is. Every emotion becomes something to fix. Every wound becomes something to hide. Every difficult feeling becomes evidence of failure. This creates enormous emotional tension, because human beings are not machines designed to function without emotional struggle. Pain is part of being alive. Fear is part of being human. Grief is part of loving. Vulnerability is part of connection. But many people learn to see these emotions as enemies instead of experiences, so they spend years at war with themselves. The body pays for this war eventually. The nervous system stays tense constantly. The mind never fully rests. The heart remains guarded. The emotions become trapped. And slowly, exhaustion settles into every area of life. Some people become so accustomed to inner conflict that they no longer notice it consciously. The emotional fighting becomes automatic. The self-criticism runs constantly in the background. The resistance to emotions becomes habitual. They wake up already emotionally bracing for the day, already preparing mentally, already carrying heaviness before anything even happens. This creates lives that feel emotionally heavy all the time, not because life itself is always terrible, but because the person never experiences internal peace long enough to recover fully. Buddhist teachings often speak about how attachment and resistance create suffering. One of the deepest forms of resistance is resistance toward yourself. Many people reject their own humanity constantly. They reject their sadness, reject their fear, reject their sensitivity, reject their imperfections, reject the wounded parts of themselves that still need care. And the more they reject themselves internally, the more exhausted they become. Because no soul can endlessly survive self-rejection without becoming tired. There are people who have spent their entire life trying to outrun their own emotions. They stay busy constantly, distracted constantly, mentally stimulated constantly, because slowing down means feeling what they have spent years avoiding. But avoidance creates exhaustion too. The nervous system remains alert all the time. The body never fully relaxes. The mind keeps running. And eventually, the person feels emotionally depleted without understanding why. Sometimes the exhaustion becomes numbness. The person no longer feels deeply connected to joy, excitement, or meaning. Life starts feeling emotionally flat, not because they stopped caring, but because the nervous system became overwhelmed from carrying unresolved inner conflict for too long. Other times, the exhaustion appears as irritability. Small things suddenly feel unbearable. The person becomes emotionally reactive because their inner resources are already depleted. Sometimes the exhaustion appears as hopelessness, not dramatic hopelessness necessarily, quiet hopelessness, the feeling that no matter how hard you try internally, peace still feels far away. This is one reason emotional burnout feels so painful. It is not simply tiredness. It is the feeling of carrying yourself through endless invisible battles nobody else fully sees. And often the person carrying this exhaustion becomes skilled at hiding it. They continue functioning, continue helping others, continue working, continue smiling, but internally they feel deeply worn down from fighting themselves every day. Buddhist wisdom offers a rare truth here that many people desperately need to hear. Sometimes healing does not begin by trying harder. Sometimes healing begins by finally stopping the war. This sounds simple, but for wounded hearts, it can feel almost impossible. Because many people believe inner fighting keeps them safe. If they stop criticizing themselves, they fear becoming weak. If they stop overthinking, they fear losing control. If they stop emotionally bracing for pain, they fear being blindsided by life again. So the inner war continues because the nervous system mistakes struggle for protection. But eventually, the soul becomes exhausted from constantly defending itself against life and against itself simultaneously. This is why many people secretly fantasize about disappearing emotionally for a while, not necessarily dying, just resting completely, resting from thinking, resting from emotional pressure, resting from carrying themselves constantly. The exhaustion becomes spiritual because the person no longer feels connected to inner peace at all. Everything feels heavy. Even simple decisions, simple conversations, simple emotions. The heart begins feeling overwhelmed by existing itself. This happens when the nervous system spends too many years trapped in survival mode internally. The body was never designed to carry endless emotional warfare permanently. And yet, many people live this way for decades, fighting themselves in silence every day. Some fight their emotions by suppressing them. Some fight their thoughts endlessly. Some fight their past. Some fight vulnerability. Some fight the need for rest. Some fight self-compassion because it feels undeserved. The forms may look different, but the exhaustion underneath remains the same. The soul becomes tired of being treated like an enemy by its own mind. This is why Buddhist awareness becomes so powerful. Awareness interrupts the automatic war. Instead of immediately resisting every painful emotion, awareness begins observing gently. Sadness appears, fear appears, shame appears. But instead of instantly attacking those emotions, the person slowly learns to witness them without violence. This changes everything internally. For many wounded people, their entire life has been built around emotional resistance. So allowing emotions to exist without immediate judgment feels deeply uncomfortable at first. The mind says, if I stop fighting this feeling, it will consume me. But often, what consumes people most is not the emotion itself. It is the endless resistance surrounding it. Grief naturally moves when allowed. Fear softens when acknowledged safely. Pain slowly transforms when met with compassion instead of war. But constant internal fighting traps emotions inside the nervous system. This is why acceptance becomes one of the deepest forms of healing. Not passive resignation, not giving up, but ending unnecessary inner violence, accepting that you are human, accepting that some wounds take time, accepting that healing is messy, accepting that emotions do not make you weak, accepting that your nervous system adapted to survive difficult experiences. This acceptance softens the exhaustion because the soul no longer spends all its energy fighting reality constantly. There is tremendous relief in no longer needing to emotionally perform perfection for yourself, no longer needing to control every thought, no longer needing to suppress every emotion, no longer needing to punish yourself for being human. Many people cry during healing not because they are becoming weaker, but because the inner war is finally slowing down for the first time in years. The nervous system begins releasing pressure, the body begins softening, the heart begins breathing again, and often deep grief appears underneath. The exhaustion, too. Grief for how long you fought yourself unnecessarily. Grief for how harshly you treated yourself. Grief for how much emotional energy was lost trying to become acceptable to yourself. This grief is painful, but it is also healing, because awareness allows compassion to enter places where only judgment existed before, and compassion changes the nervous system slowly. The body begins learning that emotions can exist without emergency. The heart begins learning that pain does not need immediate punishment. The mind begins learning that peace is possible without constant control. This transformation happens gradually. Some days the old inner conflict returns strongly. Some days the mind wants to fight again. That is normal. Healing is not about never struggling again. It is about no longer building your entire identity around struggle. Little by little, the person begins noticing moments of inner quietness. Moments where they are no longer arguing with themselves constantly. Moments where sadness exists without panic. Moments where rest feels allowed. Moments where they stop demanding impossible emotional perfection from themselves. These moments matter deeply because every peaceful moment teaches the nervous system a new truth. You do not need endless inner conflict in order to survive life. You do not need self-hatred in order to grow. You do not need emotional warfare in order to protect yourself. The soul slowly starts trusting gentleness again, and this gentleness creates energy that inner war always destroyed. The person begins feeling lighter emotionally, not because life became perfect, but because they stopped carrying unnecessary battles inside themselves every second. This changes relationships too. A person no longer projects endless internal conflict outward constantly. They stop needing external chaos to match internal chaos. They become calmer emotionally because the war inside is no longer consuming all their energy. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that peace is not something forced into existence through struggle. Peace emerges naturally when resistance softens. This is one of the rarest truths emotionally exhausted people need to understand. You are not tired simply because life is hard. Sometimes you are tired because you have spent years fighting your own heart, fighting your emotions, fighting your humanity, fighting your pain, fighting your need for compassion, and eventually the soul simply becomes exhausted from carrying so much internal resistance alone. But healing begins the moment the war starts slowing down. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually. The mind softens, the nervous system loosens, the heart stops bracing itself constantly, and for the first time in a very long time, the soul begins experiencing something it almost forgot was possible. Rest without guilt, emotion without shame, existence without constant inner battle. And quietly, gently, the exhausted heart begins realizing it no longer has to spend the rest of its life fighting itself to deserve peace. Slowly, the exhausted heart begins understanding that peace does not require constant inner fighting anymore. The soul starts realizing it no longer needs to stay trapped inside endless emotional warfare just to survive life. But even after the inner battles begin softening, Another painful truth quietly remains underneath it all. Sometimes life finally becomes calm, yet the heart still feels unsafe. The danger disappears externally, but internally the nervous system continues reacting as if pain is still about to happen at any moment. There is a confusing kind of loneliness that happens when your life becomes quieter, safer, or more stable, but your body still refuses to relax. Nothing terrible is happening anymore, yet your chest still feels tight. Your thoughts still race. Your mind still expects disappointment. Your heart still braces itself without fully understanding why. Many people feel ashamed of this. They tell themselves, "Things are finally okay now. Why do I still feel anxious?" But the nervous system does not heal simply because circumstances change externally. Emotional wounds often continue reacting long after the original danger disappears. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering leaves impressions inside the mind and body. Painful experiences do not only live in memory, they shape perception, emotional reactions, expectations, and nervous system patterns. When someone survives long periods of emotional hurt, the body slowly adapts around survival itself. The heart learns fear. The nervous system learns vigilance. The mind learns anticipation. And even when life becomes calm, those patterns do not instantly disappear. This is why some people cannot fully trust happiness when it finally arrives. Part of them still waits for everything to fall apart. Calmness feels temporary, safety feels fragile, love feels unstable, peace feels suspicious. The body quietly says, "Do not relax too much. Pain could return at any moment." This emotional guarding becomes automatic after enough suffering. Some people spent years living in emotionally unpredictable environments. They never knew when conflict would happen, when rejection would appear, when affection would disappear, or when emotional pain would suddenly enter the room again. Over time, the nervous system adapted by staying alert constantly. Hyper-awareness became protection. Overthinking became protection. Emotional guarding became protection. And although these patterns once helped the person survive emotionally, they eventually become exhausting once the danger is gone. The painful part is that many wounded hearts do not know the danger is over emotionally. The body still reacts as though survival mode is necessary. This creates a strange emotional experience where the person longs for peace but cannot fully settle into it. Even beautiful moments become difficult to trust. A peaceful relationship still feels emotionally uncertain. A calm season still feels temporary. A kind person still feels emotionally risky. The wounded heart keeps waiting for hidden pain to appear. Not because the person wants suffering, but because the nervous system learned that safety can disappear suddenly. This becomes especially painful in relationships. Some people deeply crave love and emotional closeness, but once they receive it, fear immediately appears beside it. They begin over-analyzing small changes in tone. They become anxious over delayed messages. They fear abandonment during moments of silence. They emotionally prepare for rejection before it even happens. The body reacts as though emotional danger is present, even when the relationship itself may actually be safe. This is not irrational weakness. This is unresolved emotional survival. The nervous system remembers old wounds long after the conscious mind wants to move on. Buddhist teachings often remind us that awareness is necessary because unconscious suffering quietly controls reactions. Many people believe they are reacting to the present moment, but often they are reacting to old emotional memories stored inside the body. A calm conversation suddenly feels threatening because the nervous system remembers past conflict. A healthy relationship feels emotionally unsafe because previous love once caused pain. Rest feels uncomfortable because stillness once exposed loneliness or fear. The body reacts to echoes of old wounds instead of current reality. This is why emotional healing takes time, not because people are weak, but because the nervous system must slowly relearn safety. Some people become frustrated with themselves during this process. They say things like, "Why can't I just relax?" or "Why do I still feel unsafe when nothing bad is happening?" But healing is not about forcing yourself to feel safe instantly. Healing is about patiently teaching the body that the present moment is different from the past. This teaching happens slowly through repeated experiences of safety, gentleness, and emotional honesty. The wounded nervous system does not trust words easily. It trusts repetition, consistency, calmness, presence. Over time, the body slowly learns that not every silence leads to abandonment. Not every disagreement becomes emotional destruction. Not every peaceful moment hides incoming pain. Not every vulnerable moment ends in rejection. But this learning process can feel deeply uncomfortable at first because the nervous system became emotionally shaped by survival. Many wounded people unconsciously believe emotional safety must constantly be earned or protected. They stay hyper-alert because part of them still believes if they stop watching carefully, something painful will happen unexpectedly. This creates enormous emotional fatigue. The body never fully rests. The mind keeps scanning for signs of danger. The heart stays emotionally guarded. And eventually, the person begins feeling tired all the time without understanding how much energy constant emotional vigilance consumes. There are people who have not truly relaxed in years. Even during sleep, their nervous system stays partially alert. Even during happy moments, part of their mind prepares for disappointment. Even during love, part of their heart remains emotionally hidden. Because somewhere inside, the body still believes vulnerability equals danger. This is one of the deepest consequences of emotional wounds. They do not simply create temporary pain. They reshape the nervous system's relationship with safety itself. Some people no longer trust calmness because calmness once came before painful events in the past. Maybe peace in childhood was suddenly interrupted by conflict. Maybe affection disappeared unexpectedly. Maybe trust was broken repeatedly. Over time, the nervous system learned a painful lesson. Good things do not last. This belief quietly shapes emotional reality for years afterward. The person may consciously want healing, but unconsciously remain prepared for loss constantly. This is why joy can sometimes feel emotionally uncomfortable for wounded hearts. Happiness creates vulnerability. Loving deeply creates vulnerability. Feeling safe creates vulnerability. And vulnerability feels dangerous to nervous systems shaped by pain. So the heart stays partially guarded, even during beautiful moments. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment to fear creates suffering because the mind begins living inside imagined danger instead of present reality. Many wounded people spend enormous emotional energy preparing for pain that is not actually happening right now. The body reacts before reality confirms anything. A small shift in someone's behavior feels catastrophic. A quiet day feels emotionally suspicious. A delayed response feels threatening. The nervous system immediately fills the silence with fear because old emotional wounds trained the body to expect danger quickly. This creates lives shaped by emotional anticipation instead of emotional presence. The person struggles enjoying what exists because part of them is always preparing for what might go wrong next, and this preparation slowly steals peace from the present moment. There are people who cannot fully enjoy love because they are already grieving its imagined ending. People who cannot fully relax because they are emotionally preparing for future disappointment. People who cannot fully trust kindness because past kindness eventually turned painful before. This constant anticipation creates enormous emotional heaviness. But Buddhist teachings gently remind us that the present moment and the past are not the same thing. This sounds simple intellectually, but emotionally it can feel incredibly difficult for wounded hearts to believe. Because trauma collapses time emotionally. Old pain begins feeling current, past danger feels present. The nervous system reacts now to wounds that happened long ago. This is why awareness becomes deeply important during healing. Awareness helps separate the past from the present moment slowly. The body says, danger is coming. Awareness gently asks, is danger actually here right now? The mind says, something bad will happen. Awareness asks, is this fear coming from the present or from old wounds? These questions slowly create emotional space inside the nervous system. Without awareness, fear automatically controls reactions. With awareness, healing begins interrupting old survival patterns gently. This process takes patience because the nervous system was shaped over years, sometimes decades. Emotional safety cannot be forced instantly. The body learns trust slowly, very slowly sometimes. At first, moments of calmness may still feel uncomfortable, stillness may still trigger anxiety, love may still feel emotionally risky, rest may still feel unfamiliar. That does not mean healing is failing. It means the nervous system is adjusting to emotional territory it has not trusted in a long time. This adjustment can feel exhausting because part of the heart desperately wants peace, while another part still fears it deeply. Many wounded people become angry at themselves during this stage. They think they should be over it already. They criticize themselves for still reacting emotionally. But self-judgment only deepens the nervous system's feeling of unsafety. Healing requires compassion because the body was simply trying to survive the best way it knew how. The nervous system adapted intelligently to painful experiences. Hypervigilance once protected you. Emotional guarding once protected you. Overthinking once protected you. The problem is not that these patterns developed. The problem is that they remained active long after danger disappeared, and now the heart must slowly learn something new. Safety, not intellectual safety alone, felt safety, the kind the body can actually believe. This happens through repeated emotional experiences where calmness remains stable, where vulnerability is met with care, where rest does not lead to punishment, where emotions are allowed safely, where relationships remain consistent, where peace lasts long enough for the nervous system to finally stop bracing itself constantly. And little by little, the body begins softening. The breathing deepens. The thoughts slow down. The chest loosens slightly. The heart stops, preparing for disaster every second. This transformation often happens quietly, not dramatically, quietly. The person notices they are no longer overanalyzing every silence, no longer panicking during peaceful moments, no longer emotionally waiting for collapse constantly. These changes may seem small from the outside, but internally they are enormous, because the wounded heart is finally beginning to trust life again, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to start relaxing. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that suffering does not disappear through force. It softens through awareness, compassion, patience, and presence. The nervous system cannot be bullied into safety. It must be gently taught, again and again, until the body finally realizes something it has not fully believed in years. The danger is no longer here. You survived. You are allowed to breathe now. You are allowed to rest now. You are allowed to experience calmness without immediately preparing for pain. And perhaps one of the most beautiful moments in healing happens when the heart finally experiences peace without fear standing beside it. For the first time in a long time, the body stops expecting disaster. The mind stops scanning constantly. The soul stops bracing itself against life. And quietly, softly, the wounded heart begins understanding that safety is no longer something it must fight endlessly to deserve. Slowly, the wounded heart begins learning that safety is possible again. The nervous system starts realizing that peace does not always disappear and that calmness no longer needs to feel dangerous. But even after the heart begins softening toward life again, another painful habit often remains hidden deep inside the mind. Many people still measure their entire worth through their mistakes. One failure, one wrong decision, one painful season, or one broken chapter becomes the lens through which they see themselves forever. And without realizing it, temporary moments slowly become permanent identity. There is a quiet sadness in the way some people remember themselves. They do not look at their past with balance. They look at it through shame. Their mind becomes selective. It forgets growth, kindness, resilience, survival, effort, and healing, but remembers every mistake in perfect detail. Over time, the person no longer sees themselves as human. They see themselves as flawed. This is one of the deepest emotional distortions the wounded mind creates. A mistake happens, a relationship fails, a season of weakness appears. The person struggles emotionally. And instead of seeing these experiences as temporary parts of life, the mind quietly transforms them into identity. I failed becomes I am a failure. I made a mistake becomes I am broken. I lost myself becomes I am worthless. This transformation happens slowly and often unconsciously. The person may continue functioning outwardly, but internally they begin carrying a deep belief that something is fundamentally wrong with who they are. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment to identity creates suffering. Human beings suffer deeply when they cling too tightly to labels, especially painful ones. The mind takes passing experiences and freezes them into emotional identity. And once identity forms around pain, every future experience becomes filtered through it. A person who secretly believes they are unworthy begins seeing rejection everywhere. A person who secretly believes they are a failure begins fearing every challenge. A person who secretly believes they are broken begins struggling to receive love fully. The mind keeps searching for proof that the painful identity is true. This creates an invisible prison that many people spend years trapped inside. Some individuals become emotionally unable to separate themselves from what they went through. They stop saying, "That was a painful chapter," and begin saying, "That is who I am." Their entire self-image becomes built around moments that were never meant to define their entire existence. This is one reason emotional wounds can feel so permanent. The pain itself may eventually pass, but the identity created around the pain remains. The person no longer simply remembers failure. They become emotionally identified with failure. And once this happens, the nervous system begins protecting that identity unconsciously. Every new mistake feels catastrophic because it confirms the painful belief the mind already carries inside. This is why some people react so harshly to even small failures. A simple mistake at work, an awkward conversation, emotional rejection, or personal setback suddenly feels emotionally overwhelming. Not because the event itself is unbearable, but because the mind immediately connects it to deeper beliefs about worthlessness. The person is not reacting only to the present moment. They are reacting to years of accumulated shame surrounding identity. Buddhist teachings remind us that human beings are constantly changing. Thoughts change, emotions change, circumstances change. Identity itself is fluid. But wounded minds often cling tightly to outdated emotional versions of themselves. A person changes deeply over time, yet still sees themselves only through the lens of who they once were during pain. This creates enormous suffering because growth becomes invisible to them. They cannot see who they have become because shame keeps replaying who they used to be. There are people who still emotionally define themselves by things that happened years ago. A failed relationship, An embarrassing mistake, a season of addiction, a moment of emotional weakness, a period of insecurity, a painful decision. Even after healing begins, part of the mind refuses to let go of those identities. It keeps saying, "This is the real you." But Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that no single moment contains the entirety of who a person is. Human beings are far more complex than their worst chapter. The problem is that shame simplifies identity cruelly. It reduces entire human lives into painful labels. The anxious one, the broken one, the failure, the weak one, the difficult one, the damaged one. And once those labels settle deeply enough into the nervous system, the person begins unconsciously living according to them. This becomes deeply dangerous because identity shapes emotional behavior. A person who believes they are unworthy often accepts less than they deserve. A person who believes they are doomed to fail may stop trying fully. A person who believes they are emotionally broken may sabotage healthy relationships because they cannot imagine themselves as lovable. The mind quietly builds an emotional future around old wounds, and this future feels real because the identity underneath feels real. But identities created through pain are often incomplete truths. Many wounded people develop these identities during periods when they were emotionally overwhelmed, unsupported, lonely, traumatized, or trying desperately to survive. Yet, instead of seeing those moments with compassion, they permanently define themselves by them. This creates a life built around emotional self-rejection. The person no longer asks, "What happened to me?" They ask, "What is wrong with me?" That question changes everything, because once the mind believes the problem is identity itself, healing begins feeling impossible. You can fix mistakes, you can learn from experiences, you can recover from difficult seasons. But if the mind believes you yourself are fundamentally defective, then every struggle becomes proof instead of temporary pain. This is why self-worth becomes so fragile in wounded people. Their value depends entirely on performance, success, emotional control, approval, or avoiding mistakes. The moment failure appears, their entire identity collapses emotionally. They do not simply feel disappointed, they feel worthless. And this emotional collapse becomes exhausting over time because no human being can exist without imperfection. Everyone fails, everyone struggles, everyone loses themselves sometimes, everyone has moments they regret. But wounded minds treat these experiences as permanent emotional evidence instead of ordinary parts of being human. Buddhist teachings often speak about the illusion of permanence. One painful illusion many people carry is the belief that their mistakes define them forever. But nothing in human life remains fixed forever. Not fear, not shame, not identity, not suffering. Yet many people keep emotionally freezing themselves in place long after growth has already happened. This creates invisible emotional stagnation. The person stops allowing themselves to evolve because they remain loyal to painful old identities. Sometimes this loyalty happens unconsciously because suffering feels emotionally familiar. If someone spent years identifying as broken, peaceful self-worth can feel uncomfortable or even undeserved. The ego says, "Who are you to feel good about yourself now? Do not forget what you did. Do not forget who you were." This constant self-reminding becomes another form of emotional punishment, and slowly the person loses the ability to see themselves clearly. They only see flaws, failures, weaknesses, regret. This distorted self-perception affects every area of life. Relationships become difficult because the person struggles believing they deserve healthy love. Rest becomes difficult because they feel guilty unless constantly proving worth. Joy becomes difficult because part of them believes happiness should be withheld until they become better enough. But better enough never fully arrives when identity itself remains trapped in shame. This is why external success rarely heals internal worthlessness fully. A person may achieve goals, receive praise, build relationships, or improve their life significantly, yet still feel deeply inadequate because the identity underneath never changed. The mind still whispers old labels, still searches for flaws, still measures worth through mistakes. Buddhist wisdom offers a different path. Instead of attaching identity to temporary experiences, it encourages awareness of impermanence. Thoughts are temporary, emotions are temporary, failures are temporary. Even painful identities are temporary when no longer fed constantly by the mind. This understanding creates space. The person slowly begins separating themselves from their mistakes, not denying them, not avoiding responsibility, but refusing to reduce their entire humanity to them. This distinction matters deeply. You are not only the moments you regret, you are also the moments you survived, the moments you grew, the moments you loved despite fear, the moments you tried again after pain, the moments you softened instead of becoming cruel, the moments you kept going while carrying invisible emotional weight. But wounded minds rarely focus on these truths naturally. They become emotionally conditioned to notice flaws more than growth. This conditioning often begins early in life. Children raised in highly critical environments frequently develop identities built around performance. Love may have felt conditional on success, obedience, or perfection. Mistakes became emotionally dangerous because mistakes threatened belonging itself. Over time, the child internalizes a painful belief: if I fail, I lose worth. Years later, even minor failures trigger enormous emotional reactions because the nervous system still connects mistakes to identity and emotional survival. This is why some adults become perfectionistic, overly self-critical, or terrified of vulnerability. Deep down, failure does not feel temporary to them. It feels like exposure of a defective self. And because of this fear, many stop living fully. They avoid risks, avoid emotional openness, avoid new opportunities, avoid trying. Not because they lack ability, but because their identity cannot emotionally tolerate imperfection. This creates lives shaped by fear instead of authenticity. But Buddhist awareness slowly interrupts this pattern. Awareness notices how the mind creates painful identity from passing experiences. Awareness notices the harsh inner voice, the automatic labeling, the emotional exaggeration surrounding mistakes. And once the pattern becomes visible, healing can begin. Not instantly, slowly. The person begins questioning the identities they have carried for years. Am I truly broken, or did I simply go through painful experiences? Am I truly unworthy, or have I spent years speaking to myself through shame? Am I still emotionally trapped inside old versions of myself? These questions open emotional doors that self-condemnation kept closed. At first, this process feels uncomfortable because wounded identities often feel emotionally familiar. Letting go of them can feel disorienting. The person may even fear becoming arrogant, irresponsible, or unrealistic if they stop criticizing themselves constantly. But self-worth is not arrogance, self-compassion is not denial, and growth does not require self-hatred. This becomes one of the deepest healing lessons of all. A person can acknowledge mistakes honestly without making them permanent identity. A person can regret actions without believing they are fundamentally ruined. A person can fail without becoming failure itself. This emotional separation changes everything internally. The nervous system begins relaxing slightly. The mind stops catastrophizing every imperfection. The heart no longer collapses every time weakness appears. And slowly, the soul begins experiencing something rare: emotional flexibility, the ability to make mistakes without losing all self-worth, the ability to struggle without defining identity through suffering, the ability to grow without remaining trapped inside old emotional labels forever. This transformation often happens quietly. A person notices they are speaking to themselves more gently. They stop replaying old failures constantly. They stop introducing themselves internally through shame. They stop expecting perfection in order to deserve compassion. And little by little, the heart becomes lighter. Not because mistakes disappear from memory completely, but because mistakes no longer define the entire self. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that human beings are always unfolding, always changing, always becoming. No painful chapter remains the full story forever unless the mind refuses to turn the page. Many wounded people have spent years rereading the same painful chapter repeatedly while forgetting the story is still continuing. Healing begins when you stop measuring your worth through moments you were never meant to remain trapped inside forever. You are more than the season you struggled, more than the relationship that failed, more than the fear you carried, more than the mistakes you made while emotionally overwhelmed, more than the version of yourself that existed during survival mode. The soul was never meant to spend its entire life chained to temporary pain. And perhaps one of the most freeing moments in healing happens when the heart finally understands this deeply. Mistakes are experiences, not identity. Failures are moments, not destiny. Painful seasons are chapters, not permanent definitions of your worth. And quietly, gently, the mind begins releasing the dangerous habit of turning temporary wounds into lifelong emotional prisons. Slowly, the heart begins understanding that mistakes were never meant to become permanent identity. The soul starts loosening its grip on painful labels and old emotional prisons. But underneath all of that healing, another truth quietly waits in the shadows. Sometimes the reason healing feels so difficult is not because peace is impossible. Sometimes it is because pain became part of who you believe you are. And deep down, there is a fear that if suffering disappears, you may no longer recognize yourself at all. There is a strange fear many wounded people carry silently. They say they want healing, and part of them truly does. They are tired of the exhaustion, the sadness, the overthinking, the emotional heaviness. But another hidden part of them resists peace quietly. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering became emotionally familiar for so long that it slowly turned into identity. Pain shaped the way they saw themselves, the way they related to others, the way they understood life, the way they understood love. And when something shapes you for enough years, losing it can feel frightening, even when it hurts you. This is one of the rarest and most difficult Buddhist truths to accept. Human beings do not only fear pain, sometimes they fear who they might become without it. There are people who spent so much of their life surviving emotionally that struggle became their entire emotional language. They learned how to function inside anxiety, heartbreak, loneliness, rejection, guilt, fear, and emotional chaos. Over time, these experiences stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like personality. The anxious one, the broken one, the misunderstood one, the traumatized one, the one always struggling. These identities became emotionally familiar. The nervous system built itself around them. And because of this, healing can feel less like gaining peace and more like losing a version of yourself you have known for years. This creates enormous inner conflict. The heart wants freedom, but the ego fears emptiness without the suffering. Many wounded people secretly ask themselves questions they rarely say out loud. If I heal, who will I become? If I stop struggling, what will be left of me? If the pain leaves, will I still recognize myself? These questions create fear because identity built around suffering often becomes emotionally stable in a painful way. The person may hate the suffering consciously, but unconsciously they know exactly how to exist inside it. Pain became predictable. Pain became structured. Pain became emotionally familiar territory, but healing feels unknown. And the unknown frightens the nervous system deeply. Buddhist teachings explain that attachment creates suffering, but attachment is not always attachment to pleasure. Human beings can become deeply attached to emotional pain, emotional stories, and wounded identities because they provide psychological familiarity. Some people no longer know how to relate to themselves outside of suffering. Their entire inner world became organized around survival, overthinking, protecting themselves, preparing for pain, replaying emotional wounds, managing anxiety, carrying sadness. Without those patterns, they suddenly feel emotionally disoriented. This disorientation can feel terrifying, because even though suffering hurts, it also gives identity structure. It explains the world. It explains relationships. It explains behavior. The wounded mind says, "At least I know who I am here." Healing threatens that structure. This is why some people unconsciously sabotage their own healing. The moment peace begins arriving, they reopen old wounds, reconnect with painful memories, create unnecessary emotional conflict, or return to familiar patterns that hurt them. Not because they are weak, not because they enjoy pain, but because the nervous system fears becoming emotionally unfamiliar to itself. There are people who feel emotionally uncomfortable during healthy seasons of life because chaos was the environment where they learned how to function best. Stability feels emotionally empty at first. Calmness feels strange. Rest feels unnatural. The body quietly asks, "What am I supposed to do now if I'm no longer surviving something?" This question reveals how deeply suffering shaped identity. Many wounded people built their sense of purpose around emotional pain. They became helpers because they understood suffering. They became caretakers because they feared abandonment. They became emotionally hyper-aware because they once needed to detect danger constantly. Even their strengths often formed around pain, and because of this, healing can feel emotionally complicated. Part of the person fears losing the identity their suffering created. This becomes especially painful when someone spent years receiving attention, connection, or emotional significance through pain. The wounded self became the most visible self. People noticed them when they were struggling. They received care when they were hurting. Emotional suffering became linked to connection itself. So healing unconsciously feels like emotional invisibility. The ego quietly wonders, "If I stop suffering, will anyone still see me?" This fear often exists beneath conscious awareness, but it shapes behavior powerfully. Some people remain emotionally attached to sadness because sadness became the emotional language through which they understood themselves and others. Joy feels unfamiliar. Peace feels emotionally flat. Stability feels disconnected from identity. The nervous system keeps returning toward what it recognizes. Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that no identity is permanent, including wounded identity. The self is constantly shifting, evolving, unfolding. But wounded minds often cling tightly to familiar suffering because uncertainty feels dangerous. This creates one of the deepest hidden resistances to healing, not resistance to peace itself, resistance to becoming someone new. There is grief in this process too. Grief for the version of yourself that survived so much pain. Grief for the identities built around suffering. Grief for the emotional patterns that once protected you, because even unhealthy patterns often began as intelligent survival responses. Anxiety once protected you. Hypervigilance once protected you. Emotional numbness once protected you. People-pleasing once protected you. Emotional detachment once protected you. The problem is not that these patterns formed. The problem is that they remained active long after survival mode ended. And now, the nervous system must slowly release identities it once depended on emotionally. This release feels vulnerable because wounded identity often becomes emotionally safe in a strange way. Familiar suffering feels less frightening than unfamiliar peace. Some people secretly fear becoming emotionally healthy because they worry they will lose depth, sensitivity, creativity, or meaning without pain. Suffering became connected to identity so deeply that they cannot imagine themselves existing outside it. But Buddhist teachings remind us that pain and identity are not the same thing. You experienced suffering. You adapted to suffering. You survived suffering. But suffering itself is not the deepest truth of who you are. The wounded mind struggles believing this because pain occupied so much emotional space for so long. Some people cannot even remember who they were before the wounds happened. Trauma, heartbreak, rejection, loss, anxiety, shame, or emotional survival consumed so many years that the original self feels distant. This creates deep confusion during healing. The person asks, "If I let go of these old emotional patterns, who am I underneath them?" This question can feel terrifying because healing requires identity transformation. The person cannot fully remain emotionally attached to old suffering while also fully stepping into peace. Something old must soften, something familiar must loosen, and the ego resists this deeply because identity loss feels emotionally threatening, even when the identity itself is painful. There are people who unconsciously recreate emotional chaos because calmness forces them to face emptiness they never learned how to fill peacefully. Survival mode gave constant emotional stimulation. Without it, unresolved loneliness, fear, grief, or uncertainty suddenly become visible. So the mind returns to suffering because suffering feels emotionally active. This is one reason healing sometimes feels emotionally boring at first. Survival mode created intensity. Peace feels slower, softer, quieter. And for nervous systems shaped by chaos, quietness can initially feel emotionally unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It simply means the nervous system is learning a new emotional reality. Buddhist wisdom often points toward the suffering created by clinging. Wounded identity is one of the deepest forms of clinging because the person mistakes emotional pain for the self itself. But the self is larger than suffering, larger than trauma, larger than fear, larger than anxiety, larger than painful chapters. Healing begins when the person slowly stops introducing themselves internally through their wounds alone. This process takes enormous patience because identity patterns live deeply inside the nervous system. Even after intellectually understanding healing, the body may still cling to old emotional habits automatically. The mind may still return to sadness, still seek emotional conflict, still reopen old pain. Not because healing failed, but because the nervous system is learning unfamiliar emotional territory. This learning process requires gentleness. Many people shame themselves for resisting healing. They say things like, "Why do I keep going backward emotionally?" But often, the resistance is not about wanting suffering. It is about fearing emotional unfamiliarity. The wounded self became emotionally familiar company, and letting go of that identity can feel lonely before it feels freeing. This is why compassion becomes essential during healing. The heart needs understanding while releasing old emotional identities. It needs permission to evolve without shame. A person who spent years surviving emotionally cannot instantly become peaceful overnight. The nervous system needs time. Time to trust calmness. Time to trust softness. Time to trust safety. Time to believe identity can exist outside suffering. And little by little, something beautiful begins happening. The person notices moments where they are no longer defined entirely by pain. Moments where joy feels possible without guilt. Moments where peace no longer feels emotionally threatening. moments where calmness feels alive instead of empty. These moments slowly teach the nervous system a new truth. You are more than the suffering you survived. You are more than the wounds you carried. You are more than the identities pain created around you. And perhaps the most emotional part of healing happens when the person finally realizes they do not need to keep bleeding in order to remain themselves. The soul can evolve without disappearing. The heart can heal without losing depth. The nervous system can soften without becoming weak. The person underneath the suffering was never truly gone, only buried beneath years of survival. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that healing is not the destruction of the self. It is the release of unnecessary suffering that covered the self for too long. And slowly, gently, the wounded heart begins understanding something it once feared deeply. Peace will not erase you. It will finally allow you to meet yourself beyond the pain for the very first time. Slowly, the wounded heart begins understanding that healing will not erase who you are. Peace does not destroy identity. It simply removes the suffering that covered your true self for too long. But even as this realization begins softening the soul, another painful truth quietly waits underneath it all. Many people still carry a deep loneliness inside themselves because no matter how much love surrounds them, they never truly feel good enough for their own heart. And when self-rejection lives inside you long enough, even genuine love from others struggles to fully reach you. There is a loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. A person can sit beside loving people, receive kindness, hear comforting words, and still feel emotionally distant from everyone around them. They smile, they talk, they function normally. But underneath everything is a quiet feeling that says, if people truly knew me deeply, they would not stay. This loneliness becomes one of the heaviest emotional burdens a human being can carry, because the deepest rejection is not always rejection from the world. Sometimes it is rejection from yourself. Many wounded people spend years trying to earn love externally while secretly believing they are unworthy of it internally. They hope relationships, success, praise, or validation will finally silence the feeling of not being enough. But no matter how much affection they receive, the emptiness keeps returning, not because love is absent, but because self-rejection blocks the heart from fully receiving it. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering often grows from separation, and one of the deepest separations possible is separation from your own heart. When someone spends years criticizing themselves, rejecting themselves, hiding themselves, or feeling emotionally inadequate, they slowly become disconnected from inner belonging. The soul begins feeling homeless inside itself. This creates enormous loneliness, because no amount of external connection can fully heal the pain of internal self-rejection. There are people who genuinely care about you, people who admire you, people who see beauty in you. But when the mind carries deep feelings of inadequacy, those truths struggle to enter fully. Compliments feel temporary, love feels suspicious, affection feels fragile, kindness feels undeserved. The wounded heart keeps searching for evidence that rejection is coming eventually. This happens because self-worth shapes emotional perception deeply. A person who secretly believes they are not enough often interprets life through that belief automatically. A delayed message suddenly feels personal. A quiet moment feels like emotional distance. A disagreement feels like proof they are difficult to love. The mind constantly filters reality through self-rejection. This becomes exhausting because the person is not only trying to maintain relationships, they are also fighting an invisible inner voice that keeps telling them they are fundamentally lacking somehow. This voice often begins early in life. Some children grow up feeling emotionally unseen. Love may have been inconsistent, conditional, critical, emotionally unavailable, or unpredictable. The child quietly learns painful lessons about worth. I need to achieve more to deserve love. I must not be too emotional. I must not disappoint people. I must become easier, quieter, stronger, better. Over time, these beliefs become internalized deeply. Years later, the adult still carries the same emotional pressure, always trying to become enough. Enough for love, enough for approval, enough for peace, enough for themselves. But the painful truth is this: a person trapped in self-rejection can never fully arrive emotionally because the standards keep moving endlessly. No success feels sufficient. No relationship feels secure enough. No amount of external validation fully satisfies the wound underneath. Because the wound was never truly about achievement. It was about belonging, belonging inside your own heart. Many people do not realize how deeply they abandon themselves emotionally every day. They criticize themselves constantly, compare themselves constantly, minimize their needs constantly, judge their emotions constantly. They become emotionally hostile toward themselves while simultaneously longing to feel loved by others. This creates deep inner contradiction. The person asks others to love someone they themselves are still rejecting internally. And because of this, love never feels fully safe. Part of the heart always remains guarded. Buddhist teachings often remind us that the mind creates suffering through attachment to identity. One painful identity many people carry is not enough, not attractive enough, not successful enough, not lovable enough, not emotionally good enough, not healed enough, not worthy enough. This identity becomes emotionally exhausting because it turns life into endless emotional proving. The person constantly tries earning worth instead of believing worth already exists within them naturally. And because worth feels conditional internally, relationships become emotionally fragile. The person becomes hypersensitive to rejection, overthinks small interactions, needs reassurance repeatedly, fears abandonment constantly, not because they are weak, but because deep inside they still do not fully believe they are worthy of staying loved. This fear quietly creates emotional loneliness, even inside close relationships. Some people spend their entire life feeling emotionally unseen because they never fully allow others to see their real self. The wounded heart becomes convinced that vulnerability will lead to rejection eventually. So the person performs strength, performs happiness, performs emotional stability, performs independence. But underneath the performance is often a deep fear that the authentic self is not lovable enough to survive exposure. This creates enormous isolation, because true connection only happens when authenticity becomes possible, and authenticity feels dangerous to wounded hearts. Many emotionally lonely people secretly feel like they are too much and not enough at the same time, too emotional, too sensitive, too broken, too difficult, yet somehow still not worthy enough. This contradiction becomes emotionally painful because the person keeps shrinking themselves while still feeling inadequate afterward. No matter how much they change themselves, the emptiness remains. Because self-rejection cannot be solved through self-erasure. The soul does not heal by becoming smaller. It heals by becoming accepted. This is one of the deepest Buddhist truths about compassion. Compassion is not simply kindness toward others. It is the ending of inner hostility toward yourself. And many people have never experienced this. They experienced pressure, judgment, comparison, conditional acceptance, but not true self-compassion. So their entire emotional life becomes organized around trying to earn what they already deserved naturally as human beings: love, belonging, worth, rest, gentleness. This endless striving creates emotional exhaustion because the goal is impossible. The wounded heart keeps chasing external proof of worth while internally rejecting itself at the same time. No amount of external love can permanently heal an identity built around inadequacy. This is why some people feel deeply lonely even in healthy relationships. The partner may genuinely care, but the wounded mind struggles to trust it fully. The person keeps waiting for disappointment, waiting for abandonment, waiting for the moment they become too much. This anticipation creates emotional distance automatically. The nervous system stays partially guarded. The person may crave intimacy deeply while simultaneously fearing it. Because intimacy requires being emotionally seen, and being emotionally seen feels dangerous when self-rejection already exists internally. Many wounded people unconsciously believe, if I truly reveal myself, love will disappear. This belief becomes one of the deepest sources of loneliness in human life. Not being unseen by others, being unseen by yourself. Because when someone rejects themselves internally, they stop fully showing up emotionally. They become fragmented, partially hidden, emotionally cautious, constantly monitoring how much of themselves feels acceptable to reveal. This creates relationships where the person is physically present but emotionally guarded. The body sits beside others, but the heart stays hidden behind fear. Buddhist wisdom gently teaches that peace begins when separation softens. Self-rejection creates inner separation. One part of the mind attacks while another part suffers. One part performs while another part longs to be accepted honestly. This internal division becomes spiritually exhausting. The soul becomes tired of trying to become worthy of itself. And eventually, deep sadness begins appearing underneath the performance, a sadness that says, "Why can't I simply feel enough as I am?" This sadness often becomes invisible because many people continue functioning normally externally. They work, they socialize, they smile, they help others. But internally they carry profound emotional loneliness because they feel disconnected from their own worth constantly. This loneliness becomes especially painful during quiet moments, late at night, during silence, during reflection. The external distractions disappear and the inner voice returns. You are not enough. You are difficult to love. You must improve more. You must become better first. This voice creates endless emotional pressure because the heart never gets permission to simply exist without proving itself constantly. But Buddhist teachings remind us that suffering increases whenever the mind refuses to accept present reality compassionately. Self-rejection is constant resistance toward your own humanity, resistance toward your imperfections, your emotions, your vulnerability, your needs, your wounds. And the more resistance exists internally, the more isolated the soul becomes. Healing begins when this resistance softens gradually, not through arrogance, not through denial, but through compassionate honesty. The heart slowly begins seeing itself differently. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" it begins asking, "Why have I spent so long believing I am unworthy of love?" That question changes everything, because it reveals that the problem was never your existence itself. The problem was the painful beliefs you carried about yourself for too long. Beliefs often learned during emotionally painful experiences. Beliefs shaped by rejection, criticism, abandonment, comparison, or emotional neglect. But learned beliefs are not permanent truth. This realization slowly changes the nervous system. The person begins noticing how harshly they speak to themselves, how quickly they dismiss their own emotions, how often they minimize their worth. Awareness creates space where automatic self-rejection once lived, and, little by little, the inner relationship begins shifting. The person starts allowing themselves to rest without earning it, to receive kindness without suspicion, to express emotion without shame, to exist imperfectly without constant self-condemnation. This process feels unfamiliar at first because wounded hearts often distrust gentleness. They fear self-acceptance will make them lazy, weak, or selfish. But self-acceptance does not destroy growth. It destroys unnecessary suffering. There is a huge difference. A person who accepts themselves compassionately can still grow, improve, apologize, heal, and evolve. But they no longer treat themselves like an enemy during the process. This changes emotional loneliness deeply, because once the heart stops rejecting itself constantly, relationships begin feeling safer too. The person no longer depends entirely on external validation to feel worthy. Love becomes something received instead of constantly feared. Connection becomes more authentic because hiding no longer feels as necessary. The nervous system slowly stops expecting rejection in every vulnerable moment. And perhaps the most beautiful part of healing happens when the heart finally begins becoming a safe place for itself. Not perfect, not fearless, but safe. A place where emotions can exist without punishment, where mistakes can exist without identity collapse, where vulnerability can exist without shame, where humanity itself is no longer treated like failure. This transformation softens loneliness in ways external validation never could, because the deepest connection human beings need is not only connection with others, it is connection with themselves. And slowly, gently, the wounded heart begins realizing something it spent years searching for everywhere else. You were never meant to spend your entire life trying to earn your own love. You were always worthy of belonging inside your own heart from the very beginning. Slowly, the wounded heart begins understanding that it was never truly unworthy of love. The soul starts realizing that the deepest loneliness was not always caused by other people leaving, but by years of silently rejecting itself from within. But even after this realization begins softening the heart, another painful pattern quietly remains alive inside the mind. Many people still spend years emotionally trapped inside conversations that already ended long ago. The people are gone, the moments passed, life moved forward. Yet, internally, the mind continues replaying unfinished emotional scenes over and over again, searching for something it never fully received. There are conversations that end externally but never truly end emotionally. A person leaves the room, the relationship ends, the friendship fades, the argument stops, or the goodbye happens, but inside the mind the conversation keeps continuing for years. The person keeps replaying what they should have said, what they wish they heard, what they needed explained, or how they wanted things to end differently. And no matter how much time passes, the emotional replay keeps returning. Sometimes it happens during silence, sometimes before sleep, sometimes during random moments in the middle of ordinary days. Suddenly the mind reopens an old memory and begins rehearsing again. Different responses, different outcomes, different endings. The heart quietly revisits emotional moments that life itself already closed long ago. This is one of the deepest forms of emotional attachment many people carry without realizing it. Buddhist wisdom teaches that attachment creates suffering because the mind resists accepting reality fully, and one painful form of attachment is attachment to unfinished emotional business. The ego keeps returning to old conversations because part of the heart still believes resolution is possible somewhere inside the replay. The mind says, maybe if I think about it one more time, I will finally feel peace. But peace rarely comes through endless emotional rehearsing. Often the replaying itself becomes the prison. Many wounded people spend years emotionally trapped in moments where they felt unseen, rejected, misunderstood, abandoned, betrayed, embarrassed, or powerless. The body remembers the emotional intensity of those moments deeply. And because the emotions were never fully processed or resolved internally, the nervous system keeps returning there automatically, not because the person enjoys suffering, but because the heart is still searching for completion. Some conversations continue replaying because the person never received closure. Some because they never got to express their truth honestly. Some because they still crave validation from the people who hurt them. Some because they are still trying to understand why the pain happened at all. The mind keeps circling the memory because emotionally something still feels unfinished. This creates enormous exhaustion. The person may physically move forward in life while emotionally remaining trapped inside old emotional scenes repeatedly. Years pass, but part of the heart still lives inside those moments. Buddhist teachings often remind us that the mind clings to emotional stories because identity becomes attached to them. Some people no longer simply remember painful conversations. They define themselves through them. The rejection becomes identity. The misunderstanding becomes identity. The abandonment becomes identity. The humiliation becomes identity. And because identity became emotionally fused with the memory, letting go begins feeling almost impossible. The mind fears that releasing the replay means invalidating the pain. So the rehearsing continues. There are people who still mentally defend themselves against people they have not spoken to in 10 years. Entire arguments continue inside the mind long after the relationship itself disappeared physically. The body still reacts emotionally as though the conversation is happening now. The chest tightens, the heart races, the nervous system becomes activated. The old emotions return instantly. This happens because the body does not fully distinguish between remembered emotional pain and present emotional pain. When the mind vividly replays unresolved moments, the nervous system reacts as though the danger is current again. This is why emotional attachment to old conversations becomes so draining. The person is not only remembering pain, they are reliving it physiologically over and over again. Many wounded people secretly believe that if they can fully understand what happened, they will finally feel free. So the mind keeps analyzing every detail endlessly. What did they really mean? Why did they treat me that way? What should I have said? Why wasn't I enough? But often, the deeper suffering is not lack of understanding. It is lack of acceptance. The heart struggles accepting that some emotional endings never arrive the way we hoped they would. Some conversations end without apology, without clarity, without justice, without understanding, without emotional completion, and the ego hates unfinished emotional stories deeply. The mind keeps returning because uncertainty feels emotionally unbearable. Buddhist wisdom teaches that much suffering comes from resisting impermanence and uncertainty. Human beings desperately want emotional neatness. We want clean endings, clear explanations, mutual understanding, emotional resolution. But life rarely unfolds so perfectly. Sometimes people leave without explaining themselves. Sometimes relationships collapse without closure. Sometimes apologies never come. Sometimes misunderstandings remain unresolved forever. And the wounded mind keeps replaying those moments because it still hopes emotional certainty can somehow be recovered. This creates endless inner tension, because the mind tries solving emotional pain intellectually when the real healing requires something much harder: letting go without full resolution. Many people struggle deeply with this because unfinished emotional stories create psychological discomfort. The nervous system keeps seeking emotional completion the way the body seeks completion after interrupted physical actions. So the mind reopens old conversations repeatedly, trying to emotionally finish what was left unresolved. But often, the replaying only deepens suffering. The heart becomes trapped between the past and the present, unable to fully release, unable to fully move forward. This attachment becomes especially strong when the painful conversation shaped identity itself. A single rejection can echo through the nervous system for years if the mind uses it as proof of worthlessness. A single betrayal can permanently alter trust if the mind keeps replaying it as evidence that safety no longer exists. A single moment of humiliation can shape self-image for decades if the nervous system remains emotionally trapped there. This is why emotional wounds often feel so persistent. The mind keeps feeding them through repetition. Buddhist teachings remind us that thoughts are not neutral. Repeated thoughts strengthen emotional patterns. Every time the mind rehearses painful conversations, the nervous system reinforces those emotional pathways again. The suffering becomes reactivated repeatedly, and eventually, the person no longer knows how to stop replaying the past. Some people become emotionally addicted to rehearsing because it creates the illusion of control. The mind believes that if it keeps analyzing old situations, future pain can somehow be prevented. But endless replaying rarely creates peace. It usually creates emotional exhaustion. The heart remains trapped in emotional vigilance, constantly reviewing, constantly replaying, constantly searching for emotional certainty. This becomes deeply lonely because the person may look physically present in life while internally living inside old emotional timelines. The body sits in the present, but the mind lives in conversations that ended years ago. This disconnect quietly steals peace from everyday life. The person struggles being fully present because unresolved emotional attachment keeps pulling attention backward constantly. Many wounded hearts also replay old conversations because they are still seeking emotional validation they never received. Deep down, part of them still hopes someone will finally understand their pain fully. The child inside still wants acknowledgement, still wants understanding, still wants someone to say, "What happened to you mattered." When that validation never fully arrives externally, the mind keeps returning to the emotional scene, searching for it internally. This is why some conversations feel impossible to release. The pain underneath them was never only about the words spoken. It was about unmet emotional needs hidden underneath the moment. The need to feel valued, seen, safe, chosen, respected, loved. When those needs remain emotionally unresolved, the nervous system keeps circling the memory, trying to complete something deeper than the conversation itself. Buddhist wisdom gently teaches that peace does not come from controlling the past mentally. It comes from releasing attachment to emotional replaying gradually. This does not mean pretending the pain never mattered. It means recognizing that endless rehearsal cannot change what already happened. The conversation ended. The moment passed. The people changed. Life moved forward. But the mind continues suffering because part of the heart refuses to stop emotionally negotiating with the past. This realization can feel heartbreaking at first. Many people discover they have spent years emotionally living inside moments that no longer exist anywhere except memory. And this attachment quietly consumed enormous emotional energy. Energy that could have gone toward healing, presence, peace, or connection. Instead, the soul remained emotionally occupied by ghosts of unfinished conversations. There is grief in recognizing this. Grief for how much life was spent mentally replaying what could no longer be changed. But awareness also creates freedom. The moment you begin noticing the replay without automatically entering it fully, something shifts internally. Instead of becoming lost inside the memory immediately, awareness begins observing gently. There is my mind replaying that conversation again. This small shift matters deeply, because awareness creates distance between you and the emotional loop. Without awareness, the replay feels automatic and consuming. With awareness, the person slowly stops merging completely with the memory every time it appears. Buddhist meditation often teaches observing thoughts without attachment. This becomes powerful during emotional healing because it interrupts unconscious identification with old pain. The memory appears, the emotions rise, But instead of automatically rehearsing everything again for hours, the person slowly learns to witness the experience compassionately without feeding it endlessly. This takes practice. The wounded mind naturally wants certainty, resolution, completion. But healing often requires accepting that some emotional stories will never feel perfectly finished. And strangely, this acceptance begins creating more peace than endless rehearsing ever could. The nervous system slowly learns that uncertainty can be survived, that incomplete endings do not destroy identity, that emotional pain does not need constant replaying in order to be valid. This softens the attachment gradually. The old conversations lose emotional intensity little by little, not because they disappear entirely, but because the heart no longer depends on them for identity or emotional completion. The person begins returning to the present moment more fully, noticing life again, feeling current experiences again, allowing new emotional experiences to exist without constantly comparing them to old wounds. And perhaps one of the deepest healing moments happens when the heart finally realizes something quietly transformative. The past conversation does not need to change for your peace to begin. The apology may never arrive. The explanation may never come. The misunderstanding may never fully resolve. But your soul no longer has to remain emotionally imprisoned inside unfinished moments forever. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that freedom often begins not when the past changes, but when attachment to replaying it softens gently. And slowly, almost invisibly, the exhausted heart begins stepping out of old conversations and returning home to the present moment again. Slowly, the exhausted heart begins stepping out of old conversations that never truly ended emotionally. The soul starts realizing that peace does not come from endlessly replaying the past, but from gently loosening its attachment to what can no longer be changed. But even after the mind begins releasing those old emotional loops, another painful truth quietly waits underneath it all. Many people spend their entire lives trying to become more acceptable to others, shaping themselves into versions that feel easier to love, easier to approve of, easier to keep around. And somewhere along the way, they slowly lose connection with who they truly are inside. There is a sadness that comes from constantly changing yourself just to feel worthy of staying loved. A person may not notice it at first. It begins quietly. They hide certain emotions, silence certain opinions, soften certain parts of themselves, become less expressive, less needy, less emotional, less honest, not because they are fake people, but because somewhere deep inside they learned that authenticity felt dangerous. Over time, survival turns into performance. The person no longer asks, "Who am I really?" They ask, "Who do I need to become so people will not leave?" This question quietly shapes entire lives. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering grows whenever we become disconnected from our true nature. And one of the deepest disconnections possible happens when a person abandons their authentic self in order to gain acceptance from the world around them. At first, this adaptation may seem harmless. A child learns to stay quiet because expressing emotions creates conflict. Someone becomes agreeable because disagreement once led to rejection. Someone becomes emotionally useful because usefulness brought approval. Someone hides vulnerability because honesty once resulted in shame. These behaviors begin as survival strategies. The nervous system adapts intelligently to emotional environments. But over time, the adaptation becomes identity. The person forgets where the performance began. And eventually they no longer know who they are underneath all the emotional adjustments. This creates deep spiritual emptiness, because the soul becomes exhausted from constantly performing a version of itself that feels emotionally acceptable instead of emotionally real. Many wounded people secretly fear authenticity because authenticity once felt unsafe. Maybe they were criticized for being too emotional, too sensitive, too loud, too quiet, too intense, too different, too vulnerable, too honest. Over time, they internalized the belief that parts of themselves needed hiding in order to maintain connection. So they learned to edit themselves constantly, edit their emotions, edit their personality, edit their needs, edit their truth. And although this may protect relationships temporarily, it slowly creates inner emptiness because the authentic self stops receiving oxygen emotionally. The soul quietly suffocates beneath performance. There are people who have spent so many years adapting to others that they no longer know what they genuinely feel anymore. They became experts at reading rooms, managing emotions, pleasing people, avoiding conflict, and becoming whatever others needed them to be emotionally. But adaptation without authenticity slowly creates emotional numbness, because the person no longer feels deeply connected to their own inner truth. Buddhist teachings often speak about attachment to identity as a source of suffering. One painful identity many people carry is the acceptable self, the version designed to avoid rejection, the version shaped around approval, the calm one, the easy one, the helpful one, the emotionally strong one, the agreeable one, the selfless one. These identities may receive praise externally, but internally they often hide enormous loneliness. Because the person secretly wonders, would anyone still love me if I stopped performing this version of myself? This fear becomes emotionally exhausting. The person begins living life in constant emotional calculation. What should I say? How should I act? What version of me will make this person comfortable? How much of myself is safe to reveal? Over time, relationships stop feeling emotionally nourishing because the connection is happening with the performed self, not the authentic self underneath. This creates a painful contradiction. The person desperately wants deep connection while simultaneously hiding the very self that needs to be truly seen. And because of this, loneliness remains even around loving people. There are people who receive love constantly, yet still feel unseen because nobody is actually connecting with their full emotional truth. The performance became too strong. This is one reason spiritual emptiness feels so difficult to explain. Externally, life may appear functional, relationships may exist, success may exist, social connection may exist, but internally, the soul feels emotionally disconnected from itself. The person quietly wonders, why do I still feel empty even when people care about me? Because the heart knows when it is surviving through performance instead of living through authenticity. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that suffering grows whenever we cling to illusion. And one painful illusion many people carry is the belief that love must be earned through self-abandonment. This belief creates endless emotional exhaustion. The person keeps adapting more, giving more, hiding more, shrinking more, trying harder to become emotionally acceptable. But no amount of performance fully heals the fear underneath, because the fear itself says, the real me is not enough. This fear often begins early in life. Children quickly learn what parts of themselves receive acceptance and what parts create discomfort. If emotional honesty was punished, the child learns suppression. If authenticity caused rejection, the child learns performance. Over time, these survival patterns become automatic. The person smiles while hurting, agrees while uncomfortable, says yes while exhausted, pretends to be fine while emotionally collapsing inside, and eventually they become so disconnected from their authentic emotions that they stop recognizing self-abandonment as suffering. It simply becomes normal, but the soul always notices. This is why many people feel emotionally drained after social interactions, even when nothing bad happened. The exhaustion comes from constant self-monitoring and emotional editing. The nervous system remains hyper-aware, always adjusting, always adapting, always protecting itself from possible rejection. This level of emotional vigilance quietly consumes enormous energy. The body stays tense, the mind stays alert, the heart stays guarded, and eventually spiritual emptiness begins appearing beneath everything else, not because the person lacks value, but because the authentic self has been emotionally hidden for too long. There are people who no longer know what they genuinely enjoy because so much of their life became centered around pleasing others. Their preferences became shaped by approval. Their choices became shaped by acceptance. Their identity became shaped by emotional survival. This creates deep confusion during healing. The person begins asking questions they have not asked themselves in years. What do I actually feel? What do I genuinely want? What parts of me have I been hiding? These questions can feel emotionally overwhelming because authenticity requires reconnecting with the self beneath years of performance. And for wounded hearts, this reconnection often feels frightening because authenticity creates vulnerability. The person fears disappointing others, fear losing relationships, fear being misunderstood, fear becoming too much. So the nervous system keeps clinging to emotional performance because performance once guaranteed safer connection. But Buddhist wisdom gently teaches that false attachment to performed identity creates suffering because the soul cannot fully rest inside emotional dishonesty. This does not mean people intentionally lie about who they are. Most wounded individuals adapted unconsciously. They learned how to survive emotionally in environments where authenticity did not feel safe. And those adaptations once protected them. But eventually, protection becomes imprisonment. The person no longer knows how to exist freely, only acceptably. This creates enormous inner grief. Grief for the parts of yourself you silenced, the emotions you hid, the truth you swallowed, the personality you softened, the needs you minimized, the dreams you abandoned to stay emotionally acceptable. Many people carry this grief silently for years without understanding why they feel emotionally incomplete. The soul misses itself. This is one reason healing often feels emotional at first. As the nervous system softens, buried authenticity begins resurfacing slowly. Feelings long suppressed begin appearing. Desires long ignored begin speaking again. Truth long hidden begins asking for space. At first, this can feel deeply uncomfortable. The person may feel guilty for having needs, guilty for setting boundaries, guilty for expressing disagreement, because the nervous system still associates authenticity with danger. But healing requires slowly teaching the body that authenticity no longer threatens survival. This takes time, especially for people who spent years earning connection through self-abandonment. The heart must slowly relearn something it forgot long ago. Real love does not require self-erasure. Real connection does not require constant emotional performance. Real belonging does not demand abandoning yourself completely. This realization changes everything internally. The person begins noticing where they betray themselves to maintain approval. They notice how often they suppress emotions automatically, how quickly they apologize for existing honestly, how deeply they fear disappointing people. Awareness creates space where unconscious performance once operated automatically, and slowly the person begins reclaiming pieces of themselves again. Not aggressively, not rebelliously, gently. They begin expressing small truths, allowing emotions honestly, saying no without endless guilt, letting themselves exist without constant emotional editing. These moments matter deeply because every authentic moment teaches the nervous system a new truth. You can survive being real. You can survive disappointing people sometimes. You can survive authenticity. This learning gradually softens the spiritual emptiness inside, because the soul no longer feels emotionally abandoned by itself constantly. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that peace does not come from becoming perfectly accepted by everyone. Peace comes from ending the inner separation between who you truly are and who you force yourself to become for approval. This is one of the deepest forms of liberation, no longer needing to perform worthiness every moment, no longer needing to shrink your humanity for comfort, no longer needing to earn belonging through self-denial. Instead, the person begins building a relationship with themselves rooted in honesty instead of performance. This relationship feels unfamiliar at first. The authentic self may feel vulnerable, raw, emotionally exposed. But slowly, something beautiful begins happening. The nervous system relaxes slightly. The soul feels lighter. Conversations feel less exhausting. Relationships feel more genuine. The person stops carrying the impossible pressure of becoming emotionally acceptable to everyone around them. And perhaps the most healing realization of all begins quietly settling into the heart. The authentic self you spent years hiding was never the problem. The problem was believing you had to abandon yourself in order to deserve love. Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that the soul cannot find peace while constantly running away from its own truth. And slowly, gently, the wounded heart begins returning to itself again, not the performed self, not the emotionally edited self, but the real self underneath all the survival. The self that was waiting patiently beneath years of hiding, hoping one day it would finally be safe enough to exist honestly again. After carrying so much guilt, fear, exhaustion, shame, overthinking, and inner conflict, one truth slowly begins to rise above all the pain. The heart was never your enemy. For years, you may have fought yourself trying to become more acceptable, more lovable, more perfect, more worthy of peace. But Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that healing does not begin when you finally become flawless. Healing begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself emotionally. Every wound you carried, every sleepless night, every painful memory, every moment you felt broken, unworthy, exhausted, or lost was never proof that you were beyond healing. It was proof that your soul was asking for compassion after years of survival. And maybe the greatest peace in life is not becoming someone completely new. Maybe it is finally learning how to sit beside your own heart without fighting it anymore. If even one part of this journey touched something deep inside you, leave a comment below and share the lesson your heart needed to hear the most tonight. Sometimes one honest sentence can help another soul feel less alone in their pain. And if you want more peaceful teachings like this to help you heal, rest, and reconnect with yourself, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us.